So for those of you unfamiliar with AFT, we are a national nonprofit with a three-pronged mission to 1, protect farmland, 2, promote sound farming practices, and 3, keep farmers on the land. First, we want to thank our funders of this project, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Services Conservation Innovation Grant Program. Next, I'd like to introduce our special guests. Heckert is AFT's California Regional Director, where she leads the strategy and development of California programs that provide greater opportunities for producers to engage in sustainable practices. Before joining AFT, she was the Executive Director of the Sonoma Resource Conservation District, and she's an alumna of Sonoma State University. Welcome, Kara.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about our work in California and some of the research that we did leading up to developing this project to do these case studies. So at AFT in California, we achieve our mission through the following program areas: agricultural land protection, soil health bottom line, which is the case studies contribute to that program. We'll talk about much more today. Farms for a new generation, women for the land, and saving farmland growing cities. So what I wanted to talk about briefly was a research report that we did back in 2013 that ties into what we're going to talk about today. So limiting factors to scaling up conservation practice adoption have long been known and persist. Prior to my time at AFT, I was with the Sonoma Resource Conservation District, where we participated in a grower focus group with AFT and local growers that informed AFT's 2013 publication, encouraging California specialty crop growers to adopt environmentally beneficial management practices for efficient irrigation and nutrient management, lessons from a producer survey and focus groups. And through that process, AFT interviewed 78 specialty crop growers all throughout California in 8 different regions. And our research found that the 3 most important grower motives for adopting conservation practices are reducing production costs, improving crop yield and/or quality, and improving competitiveness. Improving the environment was also important, but it was a secondary motivation. The 3 most important barriers to specialty crop adoption of practices were the upfront costs by a large margin, followed by risk of diminished crop yields and/or quality, and finally, lack of information about conservation practices or the unavailability of on-the-ground technical assistance. Upfront costs appeared to be an especially significant obstacle. We also found that the overwhelming majority of growers still self-finance these practices rather than seeking funding from government sources or commercial banks. And I think that's probably shifted a bit since 2013. We have new programs like California's CDFA's Healthy Soils program, but that's just one example. The growers also interviewed recommended that practice adoption could be accelerated if they had better access to timely information from trusted resources. They were interested in the potential impacts of conservation practices on crop yields and quality, and how easily these practices would fit into their existing operations and the return on investment. So I say all of this and give you the background on the research because it was great to come to AFT a little over 3 years ago and work with our National Water Initiative to deliver economic and environmental case studies that we're going to talk about today that demonstrate the benefit of using soil health practices using cost-benefit analysis tools. So these case studies and tools are a direct tie-in to the needs identified in that 2013 report. So I personally feel I've come full circle and really excited to talk about this really important tool in scaling up climate smart practices in California. So back to Ellen.
Thanks, Kara. And now we are so excited to have Gabrielle Ludwig here to support AFT. Gabrielle has been working for the Almond Board of California for 15 years. And as Director of Sustainability and Environmental Affairs, she directs almond production research programs and interprets the impact of regulations on almond production. Gabrielle received her PhD in plant physiology from UC Davis and her bachelor's degree in biology from Wellesley College. Welcome, Gabrielle.
Welcome, thank you, Ellen, and welcome to all who are attending this AFT seminar on this Almond Soil Health Case Study Toolkit. So why is the Almond Board engaged? Well, as Ellen just said, as someone who's been involved in this interface between research, regulatory issues, and sustainability issues for almonds for over 15 years, one of the issues we often encounter is if you change one thing aspect in your growing system, it actually has impacts, both good and bad, in other parts of your growing system. But it's always been hard to capture that. And one thing I really like about the approach that AFT has developed with NRCS is it's trying to, in economic terms, which is, as Kara just said, one of the key drivers for grower adoption, to really try and get at what are all of the benefits and trade-offs that are associated with implementing a new practice. In this case, they're talking about soil health, but we at the Almond Board are in the process of working and expanding the model and looking at it to apply to some of our 2025 goals related to irrigation management and pest management. So in that sense, appreciate everybody taking the time to learn about this process using the example of soil health, which is also important to us at the Almond Board. But again, it's the thinking behind it that we really appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. So today's presentation is brought to you by this terrific three-person team. Michelle Perez is the project leader and AFT's Water Initiative Director. Michelle leads AFT's efforts to reduce agricultural non-point source pollution through a comprehensive water initiative with an emphasis on outcomes quantification. She has an undergraduate degree in biology from Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, and a PhD in environmental policy from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. And Flo Swartz is the project economist and AFT's consulting economist. Flo served as the NRCS New York State economist for most of her career until retiring in 2018. While at NRCS, she provided economic support to field offices as they worked with farmers on conservation practice adoption. Flo holds a master's in agricultural economics from Iowa State University and a bachelor's degree in economics from the State University of New York at Geneseo. And last but not least, Paul Lum is the project manager and AFT's California program manager. At AFT, Paul promotes soil health practices through training and outreach. Before joining AFT, Paul worked as the irrigation specialist for Solano Irrigation District, and Paul has his own farming operation near Vacaville, California, and he graduated from UC Davis with a degree in plant science and agronomy. And now, with no further ado, I will pass the mic to Michelle to kick off the heart of this presentation.
Thank you, Ellen, and welcome everybody. I'm going to start us off with an overview of the AFT project and walk you through the Toolkit resources, explaining how to use them to conduct your own case studies. Then we will hear from Paul Lum, the author of the Rogers Almond case study, and he will share key findings from his analysis and a comparison to the findings from the Sauter Almond case study. After a short break, Flo will provide a training on the partial budget analysis and use of the Almond Retrospective Soil Health Economic Calculator R-SHEC tool and questionnaire. All right, so what about this soil health case study project? Why did we develop it, and why estimate outcomes? Well, quite a bit of scientific evidence exists that nutrient management, conservation cover, mulching, and compost application improve water quality, climate emissions, and soil health. But really, a lack of evidence and insufficient amount of information about the economic benefits associated with better soil health is available. So the ag community, everyone, really, we just want to know, what is the bottom line with soil health practices? So AFT developed a 2018 Conservation Innovation Grant project to drive adoption of soil health practices by estimating the net economic and environmental benefits associated with successful adoption of practices by developing an innovative economic tool and using available water quality and climate tools. We want to package the results of that analysis in two-page compelling case studies, and we want to empower our fellow conservationists to produce their own case studies featuring local soil health successful farmers. Because our theory of change is the more local evidence there is that soil health practices are indeed good for both the environment and the farmer, the faster we think we'll get more farmers to say yes on more acres. So here's the core team. I was lucky to bring Flo on board to lead development of our economic tools because she produced the NRCS New York soil health case studies, which I found to be most effective, and I wanted to model our case studies after them. I provided the project leadership and took the lead on developing the environmental questionnaire to enable data collection ahead of use of the online USDA nutrient tracking tool to estimate the water quality outcomes and the online USDA COMET farm tool for the climate analysis. And for producing almond case studies, before AFT hired Paul, we had to bring on some almond expertise and had a wonderful collaboration with Sat Darshan Khalsa of UC Davis, who helped us modify the row crop questionnaire and economic calculator to work for almond soil health practices. And Sat also assisted us with the internal reviews that Flo and I provided for each analysis and write-up. Here are the 5 authors of the 9 case studies. Justin Bodell wrote the first almond case study, while Paul Lum wrote the second. Emily Bruner, Brian Brandt, and Aaron Ristow wrote the case studies in Illinois, Ohio, and New York, respectively. Without these on-the-ground staff partnering with me and Flo to form what we call our 3-person teams, the author, the project leader, the project economist, we would not be able to produce these publications. In addition to the AFT team, we are grateful to the many external reviewers who made our case studies stronger. Under the leadership of Lynn Knight and Bianca Mobius-Clune, each case study underwent a review of the questionnaire, the calculator, and the write-up by 1 NRCS economist and 1 soil health specialist. In addition, our second batch of case studies in 2020 were reviewed by these university economists here. And we are grateful to the NTT and COMET farm staff at USDA and Colorado State University for reviewing our use of their tools for their water quality and climate analysis. I want to give a special shout out to Bianca Mobius-Clune for this collaboration, which culminated in NRCS putting their logo on the case studies to help increase their use by conservationists with farmers. So here they are, 9 soil health case studies, 2 from California, 2 from Illinois featuring soil health successful corn soybean farmers, 2 from Ohio with similar farmers, and 3 from New York who were diversified row crop farmers. It goes without saying that we are grateful to each and every one of these farmers for lending us their time, telling us their stories, and sharing their data with us. And here's what they look like on the back, featuring the economic partial budget analysis table that itemizes the economic effects the soil health practices have on the farmer's net income. Here are the 2 almond case studies featuring Ralph Sauter and Sahan Rogers, and you'll see at the bottom the NRCS logo there at the bottom left corners. For the case studies, you can click here, and I always like to remember that you just simply into your internet browser use the keywords AFT soil health case studies, and this website will pop up where you can download each and every one of them. So we hope the conservation community finds the case studies valuable and uses them in their outreach and education efforts with growers. We hope government partners like NRCS, RCDs, SWCDs, and Extension, plus non-government organizations and partners in the private sector like ag retailers, crop consultants, cover crop seed dealers, compost providers, and corporations with sustainability goals use the case studies with their grower customers to help answer questions about costs and benefits of adopting soil health practices and get their customers to say yes to soil health practices faster with this quantitative evidence. Now on to the toolkit, which I'm going to walk you through via screenshots. And I'm going to go rather quickly in this session because you can watch the existing case training videos yourselves if you want to spend more time with me opening and scrolling through each resource. If you do watch the training videos, you'll notice we changed the names of the tools from RAC and PAC to R-SHEC and P-SHEC. That is from the retrospective and predictive assessment calculators to the retrospective and predictive soil health economic calculators. All right, to get into the toolkit, start with some background on the AFT case study project method page at this website. Once there, you can scroll down for more details about the retrospective soil health economic calculator or R-SHEC tool. And if you scroll down even further, you'll find the training videos I just mentioned from the July 2020 Soil and Water Conservation Society Conference. On each of these pages, you'll find links to gain access to the toolkit, and if you click on the links, you'll be taken to this page listing the contents of the toolkit and a short form to complete. Here's a zoomed-in look at the 9 easy questions we ask you to answer before hitting submit. Right after hitting submit, this window will pop up onto your screen, giving you instant access to the toolkit. Simply click on the text saying, here's a link to the OneDrive folder, or click on the button saying access to the resources. And check your inbox because you'll receive an email providing the link, which you can easily find later. And immediately after clicking on the link, a OneDrive folder will open up with these 5 folders, allowing you to download each of the 20 resources already available. Another reason we ask for your contact information, in addition to being curious about who is interested in our work, is so we can contact you as updates become available. As you click through each of these folders, you'll find between 3 to 5 resources in each folder. So here's what's in the first folder called Training Related Materials. And look at that, a subfolder with 8 case studies indicating that it's already out of date, and we've just published the 9th case study just last December, our 3rd one for New York. And so we've got to get that 3rd New York case study in there. You'll find the complete slide deck we used at the SWCS training, a PDF version, and the training session summary or syllabus. We hope you enjoy these resources and you can crib from our PowerPoints and use those resources in your education and outreach events. So this second folder is called Identifying and Securing Soil Health Successful Farmers. The first resource is Criteria for Selecting Soil Health Successful Farmers. And because this is so important, I'm going to walk you through the most important points. We define soil health successful farmers as someone who has at least 4 years of successful adoption of at least 1 soil health practice, nutrient management, conservation cover, mulching, and compost application. Those are the Almonds soil health practices. And they have to have positive economic stories to tell. And they have to be willing to be featured. And given this before versus after economic partial budget analysis approach, farmers with much more than 10 years of adoption are difficult to analyze with this analytical framework. The second resource in the folder is the Project Introductory Materials document, which features our write-up about our project, reasons why we thought the soil health successful farmer should participate, an overview of the interview experience with us, and finally, a consent form. Given this document we developed for our use, we label it AFT example to signal to you to crib from it whatever you like to tailor materials for your project. The third resource in the folder is very important. We call this the form to collect data ahead of time because our on-the-ground staff would use it as a pre-interview with the grower to make sure he or she was the right person for the analysis. The form helps the interviewer answer and the rest of the 3-person team establish which soil health practices were initiated by the grower and when. The form also helps determine if the study area will cover the whole orchard or just a sub-portion of it. And finally, the form helps draw out the first telling of the positive economic stories. The fourth resource in this folder is a long tips document for preparing for and conducting the interviews, as it includes tips on how much time it might take to conduct the interview. Spoiler alert, it took the authors between 1 to 1.5, sometimes 2 hours for the economic interview, and a similar amount of time for the environmental interview. There are tips on editing the questionnaire before sharing them in advance with the grower, and there's an option to remove sections of the questionnaire if the grower has not adopted all the soil health practices we've listed. There's tips on what to bring before you leave your office. The computer or laptop is a good idea, as most interviewers typed responses on their computer. Your recording device, everybody downloaded the voice recorder app on their smartphone. There's tips on what to do when you arrive at the farm. Start recording. This is very important, and all of the interviews were so happy to have the recording to listen to later when they were cleaning up their questionnaires and conducting analysis later. There's tips on transitioning between the economics and the environmental survey. Some of our interviews chose to take the farmer to lunch in between the 2 interviews, and others did the second interview on another day. And finally, there's tips on how to begin analyzing the data once you're back at the office. The last item in this folder is tips for obtaining and selecting photos, so they are high resolution and have very compelling images worthy of publication. Now we've come to the third folder that houses the economic methods. I won't spend much time here, given Flo will go into great detail, except to show you screenshots of the economic questionnaire for row crops that's already in the toolkit, the economic calculator tool for row crops, and a document suggesting wording changes for the partial budget analysis, or PBA table. You'll find that the tool is set up with neutral terminology, and Flo will go into this later. In the fourth folder, you'll find the environmental methods resources. First, here's a screenshot of the entity COMET questionnaire we created in Excel to serve as a data intake form during the environmental interviews at the farm to avoid any internet problems that could interfere with direct entry into the two online NTT and online COMET farm tools. You'll also find tips on how to tweak the drop-down menus in the NTT COMET questionnaire and change them from the default drop-down options appropriate to corn soybean production in South Central Illinois that I initially developed to work for. The COMET farm staff helped us establish the last two resources in this folder for the interviews with row crop farmers, and these resources do not apply to permanent crops like almonds. Nevertheless, there are tips in the toolkit on how to analyze COMET farm results in Excel. And finally, there's a cool demonstration of how to estimate the COMET results in Excel for a row crop analysis. And here is the fifth and final folder with resources on how to write and produce a case study. The first resource provides a template for what to write and where. If you like our two-page product, here are the instructions on what to write in each section and how many words to say it in. Then we provide more guidance and suggestions on how to draw out a compelling narrative. And because we had 4 authors writing 2 case studies each, we established copy editing rules to get everyone on the same page. We offer tips on obtaining a solid review by the farmer before going to external review and before going to the printer. And finally, everyone kept us asking how long it took to complete a case study, so we ginned up this best guesstimate of the hours per task it might take another 3-person team. And here's another spoiler alert. The short answer is we think it might take 4 to 6 months of earnest effort to publish a case study if all goes well. I think that's it. We can move on to Paul's portion of the event.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your interest in our training. As the California project manager, I authored the second almond case study featuring soil health successful grower, Tom Rogers. Today, I'm going to describe our case study findings. I hope that at the end of the session, you'll have a better understanding of how the case studies can benefit you and the growers that you work with. The 2 California almond case studies feature soil health growers Ralph Souter of Akuye Farms in Merced County and Tom Rogers, whose orchard is in Madera County. The case studies are easy to read, 2-page handouts intended for growers, the ag community, and the general public. The front page of the case studies, shown here in this slide, introduces the grower, describes his farming background, and the changes he made over time, practice-wise, to improve soil health. Also on the front page is a farms at a glance section listing the county, orchard size, soil type and terrain, and which soil health practices were adopted. Here's a screenshot of the back pages of the case studies. The partial budget analysis table is displayed, showing the economic benefit derived from adopting healthy soils practices. The narrative portion also summarizes the water quality findings from the nutrient tracking tool and the greenhouse gas benefit from COMET Farm. This slide summarizes the healthy soils farming practices adopted by Tom Rogers and of his bottom line results. In 2009, Tom began improving his nutrient management, first off with installation of a fertigation system, and he also refined his leaf and soil sampling. Over time, Tom transitioned from conventional fertilizer use to ammonium thiosulfate blends. In addition, he began mulching the prunings instead of burning, and using compost applications made primarily of cow manure and some green waste. In 2018, he began managing conservation cover using native vegetation instead of mowing and herbicide spraying. From 2009 to 2018, Tom believes these practices improve soil health and tree vigor over the 9-year period, resulting in increased yields and decreased costs. This increased his annual total net income by $173,345. So that's $103,345 or $991 per acre. His 553% return on investment is significant. Tom told us his philosophy: take care of the soil and it will take care of the trees. Here we have the left side of the partial budget analysis table displaying the increases in income that Tom attributes to soil health practices. Tom experienced a 10% increase since 2009, which, as you are aware, due to the high price of almonds per pound, a small increase in yield results in a significant increase in per acre net income. Note that Roger's trees were full bearing in 2009 and not in decline in 2018. So by selecting his orchard, we were able to eliminate tree age as a factor in yield increase. In addition to the increased yields, there were several decreases in costs. First up, due to nutrient management, the ammonium thiosulfate blends, which include nitrogen, micronutrients, microbial products, and humic acids, excuse me, and due to the composting and mulching, Tom feels that soil tilth improved and his soil potassium levels stabilized, allowing him to eliminate potash applications, saving $160 per acre on potash and $10 per acre on nitrogen. Compost application also helped him cut back on nitrogen by 50 pounds per acre, and compost helped him reduce fungicide use by virtue of improved tree health. Conservation cover also adds nitrogen to the soil and suppresses weed growth. This helped him reduce herbicide application by 56%. Finally, Tom reduced irrigation water use by 25%, saving $95 per acre per year in decreased water and pumping costs, which he attributes to better soil water holding capacity. Here's the right side of the partial budget analysis table that displays the decreases in net income that Tom attributes to the soil health practices. First to notice, Tom reports no decrease in income. Regarding the increased costs, leaf sampling costs were very minor, but valuable to guide his nutrient management decisions. Use of the Flory flail shredder cost $15 per acre per year to mulch the annual prunings. Compost application was costly at $158 per acre annually for the composted cow manure and green waste, but it was worth it given how rich it is in primary and micronutrients, which Tom believes helped increase microbial activity. Finally, Tom estimates he spent 22 hours per year on learning activities, for instance, attending UC Extension events to learn about soil health practices. Roger's bottom line. So Roger's total increases in net income exceeded the decreases in net income, leading to a very large return on investment. Note, our case studies summarize the experiences of two growers, but each grower will have different results. It's not our intention to place a per acre value on each practice, but our goal is to share the findings of two growers and introduce the quantification tools that we use to determine the outcomes. Now, on to 4 slides comparing the two almond growers. Both growers attribute increases in yields to their soil health practices. Souter reported a 20% increase in yield since 2004, and Rogers reported a 10% increase since 2009. The growers made best guesstimates when attributing yield increase due to the healthier soils, accounting for weather conditions during bloom and the growing season, and annual variations in disease or insect pressure. Both orchards are full bearing when the soil health practices were first implemented and not in decline at the end of this analysis. Net income increased for both growers by an average of $824 per acre per year, which refers to the gain in income compared to the income in years prior to practice adoption. And the return on investment for Souder was smaller at 198% compared to Rogers, while the average was 375%. For fertilizer and machinery costs on inputs and benefits and costs, Souder's fertilizer costs increased by $60 per acre due to switching from granular fertilizers applied by spreader to liquid fertilizers and micronutrients injected through the irrigation system. Rogers fertilizer costs decreased by $185 per acre due to eliminating potash, since the compost provides sufficient potassium to meet the tree demand. For changes in machinery, for Souder, we decided to include his costs to install a new micro irrigation system in his partial budget analysis, which flow annualized as an average increase in cost of $130 per year, $130 per acre per year. There were no machinery changes with Rogers. Both growers experienced reduced pesticide costs for an average annual savings of $115 per acre per year. As for learning costs, Souder and Rogers on average spent $6 per acre per year educating themselves about soil health and the various soil health practices they were implementing. Now for the environmental benefits. Tom Rogers told us he observed several environmental changes in his orchard, which he attributes to the use of healthy soil practices. Quote, since 2009, we saw better water infiltration, soil tilth, and an explosion of earthworms, unquote. To model the water quality improvements associated with the grower's use of soil health practices on the entire orchard, we used the nutrient tracking tool, which found Souder's practices reduced his nitrogen losses by 98%. NTT estimated Rogers had a minimal amount of nitrogen and sediment loss. To model the climate improvement associated with the grower's soil health practices on the entire orchard, COMET Farm estimated Souder's practices reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 16%, and Rogers reduced emissions by 29%. Writing a case study, challenges and tips. The challenges to writing a case study are identifying a grower who is interested, is successful at healthy soil practices, has a few years of practices under his or her belt, is willing to share their cost and yield data, and can work with us in a timely manner to complete the case study. My advice is look for a grower who wants to share their experiences with others. To find that farmer, I connected with other growers, farm advisors, NRCS and RCDs, farm bureaus, and grower associations to advertise that I was looking for interested growers. Growers who've already implemented NRCS supported practices are good candidates. Let the growers set the meeting and interview schedule and work around their schedule. Interviewing the growers. I found that it's important to provide the interview questions ahead of time. This gives the grower some time to understand and prepare for the interview and to gather preliminary data. Get the basic farm information by email and phone to save time as opposed to meetings. Clearly separate the questionnaire by each practice. This avoids confusion and duplication. If another interview is needed, then complete each section before pausing. The questionnaire might take 2 or 3 sessions to enter all of the data and clarify questions from the grower. I found it best to limit the sessions to about 2 hours each. And I highly recommend recording the interview to capture the full discussion and allow you to refer to it later. Technical assistance. Technical assistance is available. It's our goal to help you use the quantification tools successfully and ultimately expand soil health practices across more farms. I can help you or growers with understanding how the quantification tools work, and I can provide some guidance on case studies. I can advise growers on farming practices that improve soil health. The assistance would be first come, first served, and during COVID times through virtual meetings. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope I provided some useful information that you can take home and share with the growers that you work with. You can email me for further information.
Flo Swartz, the project economist, is going to take it from here. Welcome, Flo.
Thank you, Ellen, and hello, everyone. This is Flo Swartz, and I will be using the next 45 minutes to delve into the economic methods used for the AFT case studies. We will begin with an overview of partial budget analysis, the method that we use to evaluate the financial effects of soil health practices on the farms participating in the study. Next, I'll introduce the actual tools we used for the analysis, developed specifically for this project, the Retrospective Soil Health Economic Questionnaire and its companion Excel-based calculator. We will examine these tools in more detail by going over the questionnaire and calculator for the Rogers partial budget analysis and conclude with tips for modifying some of the built-in components of the calculator, such as prices for fertilizer and farming equipment and associated operating costs. Let's start with a brief economics tutorial covering some general rules for economic analysis, partial budget analysis basics, and an introduction to the return on investment concept. A sound economic or financial analysis, regardless of the technique, must adhere to the following. All dollar values must be from the same year. We're all familiar with how inflation affects prices. Hence, the accuracy of the analysis relies on using cost or price information from the same year or time frame. All data must be for the same physical area, whether it's on a per acre basis or for a defined study area. In our case studies, we used both, but we're careful to keep the distinction clear throughout the analysis. All costs must be annual costs. This means that one-time purchases of large ticket items with multiple year lifespan must be converted to an annual basis. A good example of this is the cost of operating various pieces of farm machinery, or as is in the case of Souder, his irrigation equipment. Avoid double counting. We encountered this a lot in the row crop case studies, where spraying an herbicide in the spring frequently served the dual purpose of terminating the cover crop and as a burn down for weed control prior to no-till planting corn. In some cases, the author included the herbicide cost on both tabs, which we corrected, accounting for the cost in just one of the tabs. Paul touched on the partial budget analysis in his presentation, but I'd like to go into a little more detail here. Partial budget analysis was selected for these case studies because it evaluates the benefits and costs associated with a change in a farming operation in a simplified fashion, rather than developing and comparing before and after versions of full enterprise crop budgets. PBA, or partial budget analysis, focuses only on those variables affected by the change, thereby minimizing the collection and analysis of farm data. The final product is a summary of the costs and benefits before and after that change. The AFT studies evaluated changes in machinery use, fertilizer, pesticides, yield, erosion repair, and learning costs. The other category is a catch-all for effects not covered by the standard categories. The various farms studied exhibited different effects, and not all of the categories examined were relevant on any given farm, and therefore would not appear in the final PBA table. One item left off the list of effects analyzed was whether a farmer received financial assistance, or FA, payments. We felt it would be important to find out whether FA provided an incentive for the farmer to try out a new practice. So we did collect FA information from our case study participants. However, we did not include it in the PBA analysis because not everyone can expect to receive financial assistance. If a farmer does receive it, the payments are only temporary, usually no more than 3 years. And these payments are not the direct result of the practice itself, but should be regarded more as a windfall. They're basically not an economic effect. This example of a partial budget analysis comes from the Rogers case study that Paul just covered. The table has 2 sides. Positive effects are on the left and negative effects on the right. Each side is further divided into 2 parts. Positive effects are either increases in income or decreases in cost. By contrast, negative effects are either decreases in income or increases in cost. Results are tallied for each of the 4 quadrants and summed near the bottom with annual total increased net income on the left and annual total decreased net income on the right. And then net returns are then calculated by subtracting total negative effects and total positive effects. Note that the body of the table shows the total effects for the study area. It isn't until the very bottom that we put these effects on a per acre basis. We also calculate the return on investment shown here at 553%. For those who are unfamiliar with this term, return on investment, it measures what you get back compared with what you put in, expressed as a percent. ROI is the percent return after recapturing your investment. So if, for example, you introduce leaf sampling to your operation at a cost of $2 per acre per year, which allowed you to reduce fertilizer cost by $3 per acre per year, you would have a positive net return of $1 and an ROI of 50%. In the Rogers case study, the annual total increase in net income was over $200,000, while his annual total decrease in net income was about $31,000. The difference, or annual change in total returns, is $173,345. Dividing this number by his total costs of $31,337 yields a 553% return on investment. This means that his net income increased by $5.53 per every dollar he spent on soil health. Note that since ROI is always expressed as a percent, you will obtain the same result whether you use the per acre net return and total cost or the net returns and total cost for the entire study area. With that brief economics tutorial in hand, I'll turn to the steps we followed to develop partial budget analysis for the 9 AFT case studies. The first phase of data collection was carried out by way of farmer interviews using the AFT questionnaire that Michelle showed you earlier. As you will see shortly, the questionnaire is quite lengthy at 18 pages, but can be shortened in cases where fewer conservation practices have been adopted. Having a fully completed questionnaire is an excellent way to document the source of the information for the case study. We made sure as we completed each case study that information used in the calculator could be traced back to the questionnaire. After collecting our data, the next step was to translate and transfer the data into the AFT Retrospective Soil Health Economic Calculator, the R-SHEC. This process can be quite time-consuming as the complexities of actual farm operations must be evaluated and translated into data that can be used in the calculator. The final and probably most important step is determining whether the results appear to be reasonable based on what you know about the data provided by the grower and how it was used by the calculator. Are these the results you expected? As Michelle mentioned earlier, we had multiple reviews, starting with our own internal review, followed by the review by the grower and farmer, and finally an external review. Let's begin with a quick review of the questionnaire. The questionnaire has two parts. Part 1 collects general information about the farm operation. It includes open-ended questions that collect information useful for writing the case study, while at the same time getting the farmer comfortable and talking about their operation. Recording the interview is key to capturing any quotes or interesting stories that can make the case study more engaging. In addition, embedded in Part 1 is the 3-page form to collect data ahead of time. Michelle explained the function and importance of this form as part of her toolkit presentation. Part 2 of the questionnaire is designed to collect the information used to estimate the economic effects of the adopted soil health practices. This section collects effect information for up to 4 soil health practices in the study area for each crop grown, or in this case, only almonds. Nutrient management is the first practice covered. In addition to asking for descriptive information about their prior and current system, the questionnaire covers changes in machinery use, yield, nutrients applied, pesticides used, and other benefits and costs that the farmer may think of. The interviewer should ensure that all of the changes are due exclusively to the changes in the grower's nutrient management strategy. In cases where an effect, such as a yield change, is actually attributed to more than one practice, we asked our authors to make a note indicating the change is a combined practice effect. The second practice covered in the questionnaire is cover crops or conservation cover. The effects evaluated are pretty much the same, except as you can see, the change in machinery costs for nutrient management has been replaced by costs of planting, seeding, and terminating the cover. But after cover crops or conservation cover, the questionnaire turns to mulching. Again, effects evaluated are pretty much the same, except that change in cost for taking care of prunings becomes the first effect evaluated. Here we ask for information on costs for what the grower was doing before mulching, as well as the cost of mulching itself in order to arrive at a net change in cost. The fourth and final practice evaluated is compost application. The only change in effects included in the evaluation is, not surprisingly, the cost for the compost, both the material and the application costs. The final part of the questionnaire asks for information about changes to the soil, which supplies still more information for writing the case study, rather than additional data for the economic analysis. Information gathered includes soil type, descriptions of observed changes in the soil, changes in soil organic matter, and whether the grower has observed improved crop resiliency in extreme weather events. Now that we've taken a brief tour of the questionnaire, let's take a look at a completed questionnaire for Tom Rogers. If you'll just bear with me here. I'm hoping that you all can see the questionnaire for Tom Rogers on your screen.
Yeah, it looks good, Flo.
Thank you. We're starting at the very beginning. As you can see, we have the general information collection here at the very start of the form. And you can see that Paul, as he worked through the questionnaire with the farmer, put in timestamps from his audio that he recorded from the interview, which enabled him to go back later if he had questions and wanted to clarify something on the questionnaire. He could go back and listen to the recording and pretty quickly find where in the recording they may have been talking about something.
Flo, it looks like your calendar has popped up.
Oh, it has. I don't know why that did. Sorry.
That's okay. I think you just click into the word, it'll go away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ellen. I want to take you to page 2 near the beginning and just show you, this is where the 3-page form to collect data ahead of time has been actually inserted into the body of the questionnaire for Rogers. So this way we have all of the information in one place, both from that form and then from the interview itself. And then what I want to point out is this part here, not question number 2, which really contains some critical information about the practices that have been adopted on the farm. And you can see as as Paul mentioned, that all 4 practices were adopted on all of the acres of the farm. And so this is what tells us what portion of the orchard or the farm we may be wanting to focus in on for our study. And as we continue on through, you can see there's more information about economic benefits here. Identifying the focus field, this was something that was needed for figuring out what area to use NTT or COMET farm on. And so we asked information for that in the form, and then also information about photos for the case studies. The second part of the questionnaire gets into the portion that actually collects the information for the economic analysis. And as you can see here, it starts with nutrient management. As I mentioned earlier, this portion of the questionnaire collects some information, more detailed information about their nutrient management strategy, both before and after. This information is pretty descriptive in nature and isn't necessarily used in the economic analysis, but again, feeds in nicely to writing up the case study itself. But when we get down to question 5, we get into asking about changes in machinery use before and after for fertilizer application. And at this point, we'll take a look at this combined with, oh, I'm sorry, I'm messing up a little bit. We're going to actually switch gears here a little bit, come back to the questionnaire in a few minutes, but first I'm going to give you an overview of the calculator itself. And just to look at it here briefly, you can see that there's 12 tabs across the bottom. We start with a README tab, which has a lot of information, background information about the workbook, farm information tab, and then here you can see the 4 conservation practice tabs that are included in this workbook, a combined practice effects tab for effects that are not attributed to a single conservation practice, 2 partial budget analysis tabs, which I'll explain later, and then here at the back, these 3 brown tabs, prices, machinery, and lists, which have all of the information or built-in information that it's driving the analysis in the workbook. So we're going to focus on these first and just take a look. The prices tab includes indices for updating values in cases where I didn't have current values. I used price indices to update them to current values. This was all 2018 cost basis for this analysis, by the way. And then you can see I've got labor rate here. This is for educational activities for the farmer. I have the source for that information. I have the price for almonds. I have an organic price for almonds. I have documentation of how I arrived at that organic price for almonds. And then I have information here on soil productivity. If there was a sheet and rill erosion reduction, this evaluates the value of that based on nutrients that are no longer being eroded away. And then we have fertilizer prices down here. On the next tab, machinery, we list the machinery pieces of equipment for fertilizer application that are choices under nutrient management. And over here in column N are the annual or per acre operating costs for each of these pieces of equipment. And as you can see, I've got my sources down here with hot links to go and see them if you wanted to do so. And then the last tab here is lists, and these lists are used for drop-down menus in the workbook itself. So now we'll go back to the beginning. I already mentioned the README file. It has a lot of general information about the worksheets. One thing of importance is to note that in this cell, it tells you the worksheet is protected. Data entry is allowed in yellow shaded cells. So whenever you see this color yellow, that's where data can go in. The rest of the workbook is protected because of the formulas that it contains. And then down here at the very bottom, I've collected all the sources of information that are used in the workbook. While they do appear throughout these tabs, and especially on the ones in the back, I've collected them all here in the front as well. Now we'll go to the Farm Info tab, and you can see basic information about the farm, number of acres, acres in the study area. Is this an organic farm? If Tom did have an organic farm and we said yes, the calculator would automatically use that organic price for almonds rather than the regular price. And then down here we have the time spent on educational activities, and you may recall There was a $24.42 per hour cost on the prices tab, which is being used to calculate and get this $244 for his nutrient management learning activities. Now we'll go to nutrient management. And this is where I wanted to split the screen, because I think at this point, we'll take a look at how the questionnaire is feeding information into the workbook. And like we can see in this beginning here, and as Paul mentioned, there were no changes in machinery on the Rogers farm. And so there's nothing entered in these tables. And likewise, there's nothing entered over here. But just to give you a quick demonstration of how the tool works, we're going to play around with this a little bit. First of all, make sure that there's some acres entered here or the calculations will not take place. And if you want to, you can type in something here to designate what the benchmark is. It's totally up to you. It's not required. But if we wanted to show what happens if we, say, added a piece of equipment, we can select from this drop-down menu a piece of equipment, let's say fertilizer application, dry bulk applied, and boom, the cost per acre shows up here. In order to complete the calculation, you have to say how many times per year he's going to go over that piece of land, and then it will calculate that $5.45. To keep things simple, we will not try to put in some kind of current treatment, but as you can see, these drop-down menus appear throughout. It carries the results down here. So here's our benchmark at $545 or $954 on all the acres. Then it calculates a difference between the benchmark and the with treatment, and we get a minus $545 or a savings of $5.45. So while we were busy putting this information in here, at the back of the workbook on the partial budget analysis tab, that information was captured up here. And so it came in, change in machinery cost due to adopting nutrient management plan, $5.45, $954. But because we know Tom didn't do that, we're going to remove the piece of equipment and the number of passes, and everything goes back to 0. And we'll go back and take a quick peek. And as you can see, that information no longer appears in the partial budget analysis at the end of the table, at the end of the workbook. We'll go back to nutrient management and continue with the questionnaire, going down to the next section or next question, number 6, where you can see that Paul has entered in that steady 10%, steady increase up to 10% that he attributes to his combined practices over 10 years. So the key there is combined practices. He's not attributing it just to nutrient management. And so if we go further down, you can see in the yield impacts section of the nutrient management tab in the calculator, nothing has been entered. This, however, will appear on the combined practice effects tab, and we'll take a peek at that as we go through the rest of the workbook shortly. Under question 7, we have changes to nutrient management, and this part has 3 tables. The first one is really to capture times when the producer is just changing quantities of nutrients used, and they're not changing the form or the price of the nutrient. And in this case, if they were doing that, they could just enter in the number change in pounds, and the calculation over in the table here would be using those standardized fertilizer prices in the back of the workbook. But as you know, Tom did change the form of his nutrients that he was using, and so Paul put that information in this other table on the questionnaire, the before and the after quantities and prices of both. And now you can see impact of changing form of nitrogen applied appears over here. Paul put this information into the workbook for it to calculate based on the price per pound and the pounds applied of each. We get a net savings of $10 per acre. The calculator is designed to, if it finds a value in that cell, it's going to pull it up into this first table in order to summarize everything. And so it does show up here because it was looking for it down here. Like I said before, you can also enter just direct changes, and the default would be to take that information that was entered in the cell rather than what's down here in this table. If we go further down on both, we can see we get to a similar table for potassium. And we know that Tom no longer applies potassium, so we have what he was applying before, and then that he's not applying any now. Likewise, if we go over here, we can see the change has been recorded in the table, and he's saving $160. And likewise, that number appears up here, and it's summarized as a savings of $170 for his nutrient management. Going down still further, we'll go by, there's a financial assistance spot. Like I said, we do collect that information, but it's not used in our partial budget analysis. But here we have question 10, where we have the other benefits and costs. And for nutrient management, he does say that he spends less time out working in nutrient management, but didn't really know how much or how to put a value on it. So we haven't really captured that in the analysis. But we do have an increase in cost due to leaf sampling, and we are using the $3 price from Souter. Tom felt comfortable with that as a value approximation of the cost per acre and his 175 acres. So if we go down further here, we'll see that the leaf sampling has been entered. Pretty straightforward. It does the calculation, $525 for the total study area. At this point, the rest of the questionnaire you've seen briefly in preceding slides. I'm not going to go through it again here, but we'll focus on the calculator instead, and we'll just go through these few remaining practices and just confirm that yes, there's some information entered for each. Here we see for conservation cover savings and pesticides. On the mulching, you can see he's got his costs for burning the prunings before, and now with the infield chopping in place, so he has a net savings of, or net cost, I'm sorry, of $15 per acre for mulching. And then if we keep going, we've got compost application here, and information has also been entered on his cost for compost. And then we'll just take a visit here on our combined practice effects tab to see that yes, here are the yield impacts recorded as a combined effect. And you can see that he's saving he's earning $689 or $690 more per acre because of that 10% improvement in yield. So let's just go to the partial budget tab. We're going to spend a little bit of time here, and you can see, I mean, the first thing I want you to notice is how big this is. It goes on and on and on because it contains every combination of practice and effect that is calculated in these preceding tabs. And you can also see that columns A and K are set up with just sort of key or notation as to what you could expect to see in the adjacent cells. So for example, 590, which is an NRCS code for nutrient management, you see the impact of nutrient management on nutrients used here. So 590 nutrients. By the way, in the version of this tool that you will be receiving, a key for what these codes are for NRCS will appear at the top to make it a little easier for you to decipher these notations on the side of the table. And then when I wanted to point out the all effects, we have the yield impact showing up here as an increase in income. And then, for example, that mulching cost that we saw earlier, where he had an increase of $15 per acre, is showing up down here as a $484 cost, or cost for mulching. All of this gets summed at the bottom, which we've already talked about. We have the positive effects on the left, negative effects on the right, and then that total change, annual change of net in return at the bottom, and then for the entire study area. The editable PBA here is I created basically as a place for the author to collapse that table we were just looking at into a more usable form. So basically what's happened here is we've gotten rid of all those extra rows. And the reason that I set up initially two separate tabs for this is because it's so easy to break formulas when you start deleting things in a table. There's a lot of information that relates back to those tabs, and once you've broken a formula, it's really hard to figure out what that cell, how that calculation was happening. And so this way, you have an identical table to start out with. You can reduce it down to what we see here, and when you get all done, you can look at the bottom and go back and verify and say, oh yes, it matches, so that means I didn't lose anything when I made all those changes. And then the last thing that I want to cover before we go back to the slide presentation is just some quick tips on how to make some changes to the workbook to adapt it for slightly different situations. So we talked about, first of all, prices information, and this is very easy to change, but you see I can't click on anything here right at the moment. That's because, as I said earlier, this workbook is protected, so we have to unprotect the sheets. Another way of unprotecting worksheets is to go to the File tab, Info, and I'm not sure, maybe all of you are already familiar with this, but because I'm going to be looking at both the Machinery tab and the List tab, I'm going to unprotect them as well. So there's two different ways of unprotecting sheets. So now this sheet is unprotected. I can click anywhere I want. We go to the labor rate here. Let's just say that Tom Reynolds says my time is worth a lot more than $24 an acre. It's really worth $50 an acre. So we made that change, and then if we go back here, we can see all of a sudden he's at $500 cost rather than $244. And so it automatically updated his cost for learning activities by making that change. Likewise, you can change the prices, the fertilizer costs, etc., on down through. But as you do this, make sure that you document where you got that price from, just so that you can, anyone looking at this can understand the source of your information and for your own benefit. Now let's look at the machinery. Let's say that we're not happy with the fertilizer application machinery choices here, and you wanted to add foliar application for fertilizer. So the easiest thing is to just take one of these lines and change it. So we'll just type in foliar application, and I did a little research before our training here and found that UC Davis has a crop budget for almond production that says basically it's $34 an acre. And I'll just put my rather crude documentation of the source there below it. Obviously, you'd want to do it a little more elegantly than what I just did, but we've got our foliar application of cost of $34 per acre, and I've said it came from UC Davis almond budget. But we're not done, because remember I talked about those drop-down menus. We need to make sure that it shows up in this drop-down menu, or we won't be able to select it when we go back to that nutrient tab. So I'm just going to copy this because it has to match perfectly and plug it in here. And now, if we wanted to, we could go back to the nutrient management tab, go up here, and hopefully we'll find our foliar application, click on it, and the $34 comes in. You can put however many passes you want, and it will calculate it as though it was part of the original workbook. So those are the relatively simple changes to make, but you can obviously go back and modify the conservation practice tabs themselves. You could make them into different practices if you wanted to, or you could add a conservation practice. But obviously, as soon as you start making those types of changes, things get pretty complicated, and it'll take a lot more work modifying formulas and making sure everything comes into the partial budget analysis table the way you want it to. In fact, before you make any changes to the workbook, or contemplate making any changes to the workbook, I really recommend that you have someone with an economics background who's involved in working with you on this. And then obviously it's really important to have a good grasp of how Excel works, how to write formulas in Excel, VLOOKUP, drop-down menus, etc. All right, I think at this point we're ready to go back to our slides. Thank you, Ellen. And we're going to continue on just with a few more items on the agenda. One thing that you may recall about Tom's PBA table was that it contained neutral descriptions of various effects. In most cases, these descriptions do not indicate whether an effect was positive or negative. The tool is evaluating numerical results from calculations, that is, whether they're positive or negative, to determine where they go in the table. It pulls the associated table heading in the practice tab of the workbook to describe the effect. And so these titles are intentionally ambiguous. And looking at this segment from Tom's original PBA, we can see that the yield impact due to soil health practices is an example. To work around this, we encourage you to make further edits to the table by following the guidance in the wording changes for PBA tables document included in the toolkit that Michelle touched on during her presentation. You can also put in more quantitative descriptions based on the individual analysis, which is what we did here with Tom's PBA. Looking at that yield change again, you can see that in the final table has, quote, increased almond yield due to soil health practices 10%. Makes it much more interesting and descriptive. You probably noticed that the completed questionnaire contains a great deal of information, and one of the struggles that an interviewer faces is distilling that information and finding the appropriate nugget to put in the calculator. During the interview, you want to capture as much information as possible because it's difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff while sitting at the farmer's table. However, once you're back at the office and ready to begin using the calculator, figuring out how to translate all of that information into something usable and accurate can be quite a challenge. Keeping in mind the rules of economic analysis that I introduced earlier helps to avoid pitfalls and will improve accuracy. So be consistent and deliberate as to whether a value is on a per acre basis or is associated with the entire study area. Make sure all of the dollar values you are using are from the same year. Make sure that all costs are on an annual basis, meaning that the cost of big ticket items such as a new irrigation system must be expressed in annual terms, and avoid double counting. So in the case of the Rogers study, you'll recall that Tom changed not only the amount of nitrogen applied, but the form used. Adding Vesta microbial fertilizer was part of this change. The subsequent addition of compost application enhanced the effectiveness of Vesta, which allowed Tom to eliminate use of fungicide. The savings in fungicide could appear either under nutrient management or compost application, but should not appear under both. For the Rogers case study, we decided to show the reduced fungicide application under compost application. You can see the savings in fungicide as it was entered in this excerpt from the compost application section of the Rogers questionnaire. And here is the entry in the R-SHEC. Since fungicide is eliminated, the percent change is 100% of $100 for a savings of $100. And then I just want to thank you for your attention, and let's hear from you now. I hope that folks have been typing in questions and comments so that we can have a good discussion. Thank you.
Please welcome to the panel Sat Darshan Khalsa. We were able to have him join us. Thank you, Sat, for this portion. So let's take advantage of all these resources on the panel right now. Tom Stein asked, what kind of expertise is needed to perform the analyses and complete the case studies? Well, thank you for the question, Tom. You know, what we could certainly advise you on is our 3-person team, right? So it takes a project leader to drive the project and keep everyone moving, rowing in the same direction. Certainly a project economist. This is an economic analysis after all. So that is a critical component to provide, to make sure there's so many questions that will come up in trying to translate what the interviewer heard of the farmer to try to figure out how it's both a science and an art, is it not? Economics is. So to have a project economist at the helm is critical. And then our interviewer, our author, is the on-the-ground person that has the connection to the farmer, learns the story intimately, establishes trust and relationship to allow for follow-up questions, because it will come up. And so that is our 3-person team. We can certainly imagine you doing it differently. Perhaps if you eliminated everybody, all but the economists, that would probably be a safe way to go. But then you don't benefit from the camaraderie, the review, Perhaps, you know, an economist can be found, but doesn't have great, shall we say, bedside, you know, personality, you know, great camaraderie with the farmer. So you can do it any way you want, but that we certainly know a 3-person team approach works. I'll try to be quicker with my answers in case we need that. Anything to join? Anything to offer? Others? And as we, you know, mentioned before, we had to bring on expertise, right? When we switched from row crops to almonds, Flo, from, you know, expert from New York agriculture, unfamiliar with almonds, me, unfamiliar with almonds before Paul joined. So having Sat Darshan come on board to tell us all of we needed to know about soil health practices as it applies to almonds was critical. So if you're thinking of expanding this to another permanent cropping system or to a different system altogether, make sure you have that expert on your team to help you translate it and make it apply.
I just want to comment briefly for the audience that a lot that was done here to translate this work from row crops into almonds is very valid, but actually a lot of the practices in almonds for soil health practices also apply to other orchard crops. I would even venture to say vineyards as well, but I know that that might not be the case. So if you are working with growers who might be growing walnuts, pistachios, stone fruits, cherries, those kinds of things, a lot of this that we've developed here might also apply to orchards as well. So in a lot of my work, you know, almond is the model crop because of its intensity of nutrients and water that it needs. But a lot of the research we do can translate to other orchards as well. So don't be shy to think about using this in other crops outside of almonds, because I think a lot of it, what we're doing here around practices and outcomes can certainly apply to other orchards.
Thank you, Sat. Great.
I'd like to add.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
As far as the case study development and level of detail and review, it really is going to affect the accuracy of the findings. And, you know, we talk to the growers, what do they expect? What do they want? And, you know, due to the intensity and the amount of data gathering, and as Michelle said, you know, you could fashion this, you know, according to the growers' wants and, you know, what the grower expects and what the grower needs. But going into the detail of, you know, the method and questionnaire and the calculator, if the grower is willing to spend time, and if you have the time to enter all of the data and use the tool fully, the result is going to be a more accurate picture of you know, of the results.
Michael Roots, thank you for your question. He asks, for soil health, do you think soil sampling along with tissue sampling would be helpful to note changes, for example, increased organic matter? Indeed, the final page of the questionnaire includes questions about soil health changes. And we implore the farmers that we interviewed to report to us if they've collected such information over time and have a table that asks year by year, field by field, if you know we're doing an analysis on more than one field, what were the soil sampling results? And some farmers came up with that for us and others did not. And so where available, and that was part of the narrative story that we could tell, we did that. But in a lot of cases, you know, soil testing is evolving. Soil health metrics are evolving. Certainly soil organic matter is the quintessential soil test metric to be able to test over time. So it depends upon availability, but we certainly do strive to ask for that.
A good rule of thumb, if you're going to be doing any monitoring, or if your growers you partner with do monitoring, it's good to advise them, one, if they're going to take soil samples, try to take it at the same year that they took the baseline or the original sample. If you take a sample in fall and then take another one the year later in spring, you might get a very different number. So try to take it around the same season over years. And then of course, leaf sampling is a good strategy to monitor, a practice to make sure that it's, it's creating a benefit or not harming the nutrition plan for that particular crop. So, and a lot of growers are already doing this and they know this information. So that's a good practice that most growers are doing, and you can ask them about it if they've seen any changes in their leaf nutrients over time. But really, as Michelle's saying, the basis to all of this is seeing changes in soil organic matter. In California soils in particular, and our climates, we can't expect that value to just keep increasing linearly and never flatten out. It will level out over time. But we want to make sure that if we're going to be able to show changes over 2, 3, 4 years, that we're taking samples at about the same time of year so you can compare them properly.
Absolutely. We are going to be sharing with you the predictive assessment calculator, the P-SHEC tool, in day 2's session next Tuesday. We're very excited about that. And that relies on the soil organic matter information from COMET Planner to help us predict long-term implementation of these soil health practices and the resulting soil organic matter. And I won't give away much more than that, save it for next Tuesday, but also to share with you that we are embarking within the next month, we hope, on a 5-year new SIG grant. We were lucky enough to land an on-farm SIG trials project, and with Paul and the rest of the California team, we'll be working with 4 to 6 farmers over 5 years to begin adoption of soil health practices and take actual soil tests over time, collect actual production economic information over time, conduct water quality and climate modeling as we go along, not just monitoring, but we'll also do some modeling. And at the end of the 5 years, produce an economic and environmental case study, certainly longer than two pages, to be able to show and track actual changes in these soil tests and other metrics over time, the effect of these practices. We're excited to start that project. Suffice it to say, to culminate that, we've developed this retrospective soil health economic tool, calculator tool. We're going to teach you and show you some highlights and previews of the predictive soil health economic tool. And in a month, we'll begin a 5-year project working on tentatively what we're calling an actual soil health economic calculator tool to be able to process actual economic information in real time. Welcome everyone to day 2. I'll start us off with a training on the environmental methods by giving you insights into using the USDA's NTT and COMET farm tools to conduct retrospective analyses of the nutrient, sediment, and greenhouse gas benefits associated with already adopted soil health practices. And then we'll take a short break. Next, Flo will preview for the very first time ever the new Predictive Soil Health Economic Calculator, or P-SHEC tool, and questionnaire, which we hope you almond ag professionals in the audience may be interested in using once it's released later this year, to conduct predictive assessments of almond growers who are on the fence about soil health practices, to give them a sense of the potential costs and benefits they may experience in the short term and in the long term associated with practice adoption. And then we'll take another short break. And then Paul, with the grower's permission, will share for the first time ever preliminary results of one grower's predictive assessments. Well, let's get underway. First, I'll start out with some background on why we wanted to add an environmental analysis to our case studies. Then I'll provide an overview of the 2 tools we use to conduct the water quality and climate analyses, and show you the data forms that the developers of these online tools provide upon request to the users of their tools. and then I'll walk you through the Almond version of the NTT COMET questionnaire in Excel that we developed like the row crop version to enable our staff to conduct just one environmental interview to obtain the data needed for both tools. So when we first started developing our SIG project proposal, we took a look around at all the handful of terrific economic case studies that featured soil health successful farmers that came before ours, and we found the following. 2 case studies that Flo authored that I mentioned on the day 1 training, and they were 2-page products that we modeled our case studies after. We found 5 terrific cover crop case studies from Lauren Cartwright of Missouri NRCS, and those were anonymous farmers from Missouri. Then there are 4 terrific case studies by NACD and Datu Research, and those are much longer, about 16 pages each, and provide more details. So please check those out if more details resonates with you. And then there are 3 terrific case studies by EDF-SHEC Tool, and they're about 4 pages each, embedded in a much longer report. This last set of case studies used a full farm enterprise budget approach to conduct their economic analysis to contrast, and that is in a contrast to all the other case studies that used a partial budget analysis like AFT did. So if you'd like to explore that economic approach, please check out the EDF-SHEC Tool report. All right. Aside from providing us with great approaches to modeling our economic case studies after, we noticed that none of the preceding case studies conducted an environmental analysis, though some farmers did provide some soil sampling results like a few of our farmers did for us too. So when we were writing our proposal to the SIG program, we said we would explore soil sampling as an environmental analysis, but ultimately we did not pursue it. The idea was that we would ask our soil health successful farmer if we could take soil samples on their fields and then ask their neighbors who were not implementing soil health practices if we could take soil samples on their fields to make a comparison. Well, you can see just how thorny that approach might have been for our farmers, and so that idea petered out. Rather, all the authors were on board and excited about the idea to try using existing and available predictive modeling tools for environmental analysis and see if and how they would work if applied in a retrospective fashion. So, why did we select NTT and COMET farm tools for our environmental analysis? Through our review of a handful of tools, we learned that the NTT and COMET Farm are the only publicly available tools that do not require users to have a computer modeling background, are meant for use by conservationists and farmers, and are able to conduct specific management and site-specific environmental analysis, which I'll go into much more detail about later. We considered but ruled out the famous COMET Planner tool, which is famous because it's so quick and easy to use. It's just 4 clicks and you're done, because it only provides a generalized greenhouse gas estimate. And we wanted to really focus on farm-specific environmental estimates. So the authors and I readily admit that it was a lot of work to layer on the water quality and climate analysis into the case studies. And there are only, there's only a little bit of space on the back of the 2-page product to squeeze in about 2 to 3 sentences to feature the environmental analysis. Here's an excerpt of Ralph Sauter's environmental analysis on an 11-acre field in his orchard. I'm just going to read it out to establish for you how we presented this information. To estimate the water quality and climate benefits experienced on one of Ralph's 11-acre fields, USDA tracking tool was used, which found Ralph's use of nutrient management, conservation cover, mulching, and compost application reduced nitrogen losses by 98%. On the same 11-acre field, USDA's COMET Farm tool estimates that Ralph's soil health practices resulted in a 16% reduction in total greenhouse gases, which corresponds to taking 3/4 of a car off the road. You'll notice that we did not include the before or after water quality or climate losses in pounds per acre or tons per acre, because the authors and I concluded we did not want such information tied to one farmer. We felt that's more appropriate for an aggregated summary of multiple farmers in a project. You'll also see that we converted the tons of GHG emissions reduced on an 11-acre field to an equivalent number of cars using the EPA GHG equivalency calculator, which is a fun way to make these otherwise dry statistics come to life. Well, the authors and I readily admit moving on to the next slide, thank you. This is a reminder of what's currently available in the toolkit in the 4th folder for environmental methods resources and what we will be adding soon. First, here's a screenshot of the Almond version of the entity questionnaire that we'll share with the registrants of this webinar by the end of the day today or first thing tomorrow, and we'll share with the general public within the next few weeks. The row crop version of the questionnaire is already available for download in the toolkit. Soon, we'll add the new tips document for Almonds on how to tweak the drop-down menus in the entity COMET questionnaire to change them. For a demonstration on how to do that, rather than show you how to do it today, you can watch video 5 in the existing toolkit and skip to these minute marks. The last 2 resources in the toolkit are meant only for row crops for how to use Excel to analyze COMET results and conduct a retrospective analysis. So if you have row crop farmers, you might find these resources useful and can watch video 5 for tutorials on how to use them. Pardon me. All right, here is the nutrient tracking tool homepage where you can create a username and password to start your free account. You'll see clickable icons for information about NTT, what's new, presentations, and a contact us button. Also at the bottom of this page, you'll see a variety of links, including instructions, a help button, and frequently asked questions. Pardon me. For your reference, here is the official URL of the website. Some helpful resources to point out are a 2-minute introductory video, a 15-minute training video, and also the user manual. If you're going to use NTT, I highly recommend you get in touch with either or both Mindy Selman or Dr. Ali Saleh, who are the point persons and developers of the tool for USDA and for Tarleton State University, respectively. Mindy and Ali provided training to our team of 4 authors. They also entertained troubleshooting questions about proper data entry into the tool, and they reviewed and confirmed or corrected our interpretation of the results. We can't thank them enough for this valuable service they provided our project and continue to enjoy working with them as we move forward. Thank you also to Mindy for sharing several slides and screenshots that helped me develop this presentation. It goes without saying that I'm not an NTT developer, so all detailed questions about NTT should be directed to Mindy or Ali, and I hope they forgive me if I get anything wrong. Here are some basics about NTT. It's a free online field scale tool for estimating nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment losses from crop and pasture lands, and croplands include grapes and almonds. NTT was initially developed to be a predictive tool, allowing users to run what-if conservation practice scenarios on the fields to compare baseline water quality losses to reductions associated with conservation practice adoption. NTT requires before versus after scenario approaches, and I'll share more about this later. NTT is unique among 5 other available water quality tools that AFT reviewed in recent publication called a Guide to Outcomes Estimation Tools, in that it's the only one that provides both field-specific management analysis and site-specific environmental analysis. All the other tools provide generalized estimates of water quality outcomes. And since we wanted to analyze the water quality effects attributable to the management actions of our soil health successful farmers, given the soils, the slopes, and weather data associated with their field, it was a no-brainer for us to use NTT. So under the hood, the nutrient tracking tool runs the Agriculture Policy Environmental Extender Model, or APEX, which is one of the most widely respected and most commonly used agro-environmental models on the planet, and it enables this site-specific and management-specific analysis. The site-specific analysis is enabled by these underlying environmental data sets used by APEX, including the National Soils Database, the Prison Climate Database, and a 30-meter digital elevation model to estimate slope. The NTT tool was initially developed by the Texas Institute for Applied Environmental Research, or TIAER, and NRCS between 2008 and 2010, and now USDA's Office of Environmental Markets and TIAER continue to develop the current 3rd generation version that is national in scope. Here are a few tips to think about as you build before versus after conservation scenarios in NTT. I created this visual aid to help describe the before versus after scenario approach. It's important to understand that there are no specific years in NTT, just the baseline scenario, also known as before, and the conservation scenario, aka after having adopted conservation practices. You can choose to evaluate one practice at a time to isolate the effect of each practice, or to combine practices together to observe the combined effect, which is what we did for our farmers because they implemented multiple soil health practices. So for all the many questions that NTT asks you about planting, harvesting, etc., all the way down to liming, burning, and structural conservation practices, for each of those, as long as you are referencing your before soil health practice implementation timeframe, you're answering those same questions, building those same scenarios for the after soil health practice timeframe on that same field. That contrast helps NTT generate a results table that displays the before and after scenario water quality losses and the percent change for nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, water flow, and yield, etc. So, to get started in NTT, you'll start out by outlining and naming the focus field you want to analyze, forgive me. You may recall from day one of the training seminar that focus field is a term AFT came up with to help our authors determine which field the farmers wanted to analyze using the environmental methods in case it didn't turn out to be the entire study area being used for the economic analysis. There are a variety of ways to find your focus field. You can upload a shapefile of the field or orchard if you have one. You can find your field by typing in an address or using lat-long coordinates, or selecting your county and then zooming in using the satellite mapping system. Then you use the drawing utility feature, that little polygon button at the top of the screen, to start clicking on the field corners and drawing a polygon of your area of interest, or AOI, which is an NTT and a COMET term. After finding your focus field or area of interest, NTT will provide you with information it knows about the field, which you can confirm or adjust as you see fit, such as field size, type of soils, and proportion of the fields with those soils. And it's optional, but if you do have soil test information, you can add those details as well. Next, NTT will ask the user to build and name baseline and conservation scenarios. You can start by clicking on Add New Scenario to build any number of baseline and conservation scenarios. Thank you to Ellen Yeatman for developing these scenarios this week to get ready for this webinar. And thank you to Paul Lum for sharing a few of his NTT and COMET screenshots from his Rogers analysis that are also filling out this slide deck, as are several slides from the NTT and COMET developers themselves. Next, you'll start fleshing out your baseline and then conservation scenarios on pages that look like this, which is displaying the planting and fertilizer details. To input this data, simply click on the Add New Operation link at the top right of the page. To edit the data, click on the pencil icon to make changes. And to add a cover crop when you're building your after conservation scenario, click on the Add Cover Crop button at the top of the left page. One thing you may be wondering about is what's up with this planting question, given that's a typical row crop question, but not very applicable to almond production. This is required in NTT in order to move forward through the tool, so we simply chose a March 5 date and a transplanter type for type of planting to move on. Planting and tillage questions may be applicable in COMET Farm because the almond orchard may have been a row crop operation in the early years, but in NTT, you'll want to develop before and after scenarios that are solely reflecting almond production. Pardon me. Whenever you click on Add New Operation, you'll see a page like this one. We've selected a fertilizer operation here. And then you'll see fertilizer related questions like application date, type, rate, method, and depth. If there's a second, third, or fourth fertilizer application that is made over the course of the growing season, you'll fill this form out as many times as needed by using the Add More button at the bottom. This screenshot displays the irrigation data entry and the harvest data entry that has been made. After you're done providing this information, click on Add New Operation to keep specifying the remaining details, like if there was manure or compost application, liming, burning, or structural practices. Next, NTT has a structural conservation practice section that wants to know if structural practices were added to the field like wetlands, ponds, or vegetative buffers to mitigate water quality losses. In addition, there is an auto-irrigation, auto-fertigation feature that is useful to almond growers wanting to analyze the effect of, say, increasing irrigation efficiency, changing the number of days of irrigation, the percent allowable water stress, etc. There is also the opportunity to model changes in nitrogen application rates through the fertigation system in the before baseline versus after conservation scenarios. And there is also an opportunity to use a manual irrigation feature to provide data about the drip, sprinkler, furrow, flood, and furrow diking irrigation systems that may be used, the irrigation dates and irrigation amounts, and the efficiency of the irrigation system. So after building, naming, specifying, and running the baseline and conservation scenarios in NTT, the results table will look a little bit like this. Note, this is a screenshot of a corn-soybean analysis from a training provided by Mindy, because recall that I said the authors and I made a decision not to share actual pounds or tons of nutrient sediment or GHG losses for any individual farmers. I'll quickly walk you through this very cool table. First, notice that the corn-soybean before baseline scenario water quality losses are found in this first pink column with confidence intervals provided in parentheses for the estimates of total nitrogen, total phosphorus, surface or subsurface or tile drain flow, whatever is applicable to the focus field, and other water information, total sediment, and estimated crop yield. You'll see that if you click on the main water quality categories, you can drill down into additional details like organic nitrogen, runoff, subsurface, or tile drain nitrogen. The next bluish-green column displays a split application conservation scenario showing reductions in the water quality losses and a percent change as well. The next dark blue column shows a split application plus cover crops conservation scenario. Okay, now on to the COMET farm tool for conducting a greenhouse gas emissions analysis. This screenshot shows the COMET farm homepage, and the yellow-orange button is where you'll click to establish a username and password to set up a free account. Then there are a variety of helpful icons that you can click on to get answers as to why you should use COMET Farm Tool, the USDA GHG methods behind them, what information is needed, and how the results are calculated, etc., and an overview video. And there are clickable links at the top of the screen, such as Home, Tool, Info, and Help. Here are the resources for the COMET Farm Tool, starting with the URL for your easy reference. There are 3 to 36-minute YouTube videos available, and there are 15 written PDF tutorials. Like the case with the NTT tool developers, we also relied heavily on the developers of COMET Farm, so a big thank you to Haley Nagel and Mark Easter, and previously to Matt Sturmer, all with Colorado State University, that is, for their training sessions, troubleshooting, the reviews of our authors' data entry, and the interpretation of our results. Matt Sturmer taught us how to export the COMET results for the row crop farmers to conduct that retrospective analysis. Thank you also to Haley for sharing several slides and screenshots that helped me develop this presentation. And again, I'm not a COMET Farm tool developer, so all detailed questions about COMET should go to Haley or Mark. Pardon me. COMET is a free web-based greenhouse gas inventory tool for land designed for conservation scenario analysis. Conservationists and farmers can use COMET to run what-if scenarios on fields to compare current management of GHG emissions to reductions associated with conservation practices in future management scenarios. The calculation methods for the soil-related GHG emissions come from the Descent dynamic model. The livestock GHG emissions come from statistical models based on USDA and US university research, and the energy-related GHG emissions are based on models used in the NRCS Energy tool. So, similarly to the NTT tool, users of COMET Farm also start out by finding, outlining, and naming their focus field. And just like NTT, users can upload a shapefile or of the field if available, find the field by typing the address or the county and then zooming in, or drawing the shape of the field using polygon drawing features similar to NTT. COMET Farm, pardon me, eases you in with a handful of historic management questions asking for information about how the field was managed pre-1980. Was there irrigation occurring? Was it being grazed? Was there a conservation reserve program, CRP contract on it? And then how was it managed between 1980 and 2000? And if there was tillage occurring, what kind of tillage? The reason that COMET Farm goes back so many years is to understand the management on the focus field is because it needs that information to inform the mathematical algorithms representing the complex soil, chemical, physical, and biological changes that occur from land use and management changes in order to be able to estimate the effect of those changes on the greenhouse gas emissions from that field. We also see on this page useful reminders of where we are at in the process. We've completed the parcel location process to find our focus field, and now we're at the historic management section. Now on to the baseline management stage, where we answer questions year by year between 2000 and the last year available data, 2019 or 2020 or 2018, as in the case of the solder case study, to provide baseline management data needed by the COMET Farm tool. On the next few slides, I'll zoom into 3 different sections of this first screenshot so you can see the details better. So, just like NTT, COMET asks very similar questions about crop and planting dates, tillage, fertilizer application, manure and compost application, irrigation, liming, and burning. But this time, instead of building baseline versus conservation scenarios reflecting the before time period and the after time period, you're asked to specify year by year over a 20 period what was grown and how it was grown. In this screenshot, COMET Farm is asking, quote, for this parcel F1 in 2005, what crop did you plant? When did you plant it? And when did you harvest? So for orchard vineyard crops, that was selected, and almonds were specifically chosen from these drop-down menus. And then there are questions about pruning or renewing and clearing the orchard in that year 2005. And then all of the questions associated with the 7 categories circled above previously need to be answered for this each year on this field between 2000 and the latest available year of analysis. Now let's zoom into this column, tracking progress of year-to-year data entry. This is a screenshot of the Rogers almond data entry that Paul developed. You'll see that prior to 2005, the almond orchard was a grow crop farm growing cotton, dry beans, and corn. So for the years COMET Farm will be very interested in tillage that was occurring to plant those crops and other details pertinent to row crops. But in year 2005, the COMET Farm tool needs to know how the almond orchard was planted and is being managed every year, and how the management was changing over time. Here's a screenshot for you to get a sense of the fertilizer application input format in COMET Farm. You can see the dates in each specific year between 2000 and 2019 when fertilizer was applied, and the rate at which it was applied. In this case, this is the 2007 screenshot, either in pounds of fertilizer per acre or pounds of total N applied per year. One thing to point out is that this is a greenhouse gas tool, and COMET Farm only cares about nitrogen, not phosphorus, because nitrogen is greenhouse gas emission, while phosphorus is not. It's only a water quality pollutant. All right, next screen. And here is a screenshot of the irrigation questions that COMET Farm asks each year. The date irrigation occurred and how many inches of water were applied. And now finally, after entering in all of that data for years 2000 to possibly even 2020, if you all get started this year, 2021, looking back at 2020, to reflect the current management scenario, COMET Farm asks you to build future management scenarios for the next 20 years to serve as your what-if scenarios. For the almond growers, Matt Sturmer of CSU advised Justin and Paul, our authors, to simply copy and repeat the last year of soil health practices that were being used, 2018 for Sauter and 2019 for Rogers, into each year in the 20-year future scenario. We did not add on practices or tweaks that Sauter or Rogers were considering using in the future, because that would end up being a predictive future assessment, and we were trying to conduct a retrospective assessment. And remember, for the row crop farmers in our case study, we did export the 18, 19, or 20 years of data from each farmer into Excel, and we did our retrospective analysis that way, which you can learn more about in video 5 located in the toolkit. And finally, we arrived at the COMET Farm Tool results table, also fondly referred to as the GUI table or graphical user interface. And here is a screenshot of a random row crop analysis provided by Haley Nagel, as we did not want to show actual tons of greenhouse gases associated with any individual farmer, and we only report on the % reduction. First, you'll see similar columns to the NTT results table, as there are baseline management and conservation scenario columns providing the estimates of emissions losses for carbon, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. The total greenhouse gas emissions and changes in emissions is provided in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. Like NTT, there are also confidence intervals, which don't appear to be working on this screenshot. See the bottom line finding here in the bottom row. The field was emitting nearly 25 tons of CO2 equivalent total greenhouse gases, and with no-till, emissions could drop to negative 14 tons of CO2 equivalent total GHGs, resulting in a 39-ton CO2 equivalent reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we don't have to stop here. We can take this 39 tons over to the EPA greenhouse gas equivalency calculator website. Once there, we input that 39 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent total GHG gases into this website, and it immediately lets us know that is approximately the same as taking 8 cars off the road for 1 year, or about 97,000 miles driven by an average passenger vehicles, and all these other fun ways to put the number of pounds, or in our case, the percentage reduction, which we report out, into a different context and help tell a more interesting story. All right, now to show you the data entry forms that are available upon request from the NTT and COMET developers. Here's a screenshot of the first page of a 2¼ page Word data entry form from the NTT developers for use on cropland. You could reach out to Mindy and Dr. Saleh to ask them if they could create one for you for almonds. Next is a screenshot of the first page of a 13-page fillable PDF data entry form from the COMET Farm developers for cropland. It is also available upon request. There are other forms for agroforestry and forestry and animal ag, but none for orchards to the best of my knowledge, but do reach out and find out if they have created that. But this form at the time was not fully functioning for us. And because we wanted to avoid asking very similar questions of our farmers, we decided to create our own combined data entry farm, which is what I'm going to turn to now. All right. Well, folks, hopefully you see my screen here. This is the COMET NTT data entry tab in our AFT NTT COMET questionnaire for almonds. Thank you for helping get this up and ready, Ellen, to get ready for sharing during this webinar. So the first thing that I want to point out is the 3 preceding tabs. This is where we encouraged our authors to copy and paste that form to collect data ahead of time document that you remember us presenting in the day one webinar, which really gets the farmer and the author on the same page regarding which soil health practices were adopted when and on how many acres, and helps identify if your focus field is going to be different from your study acres. The next tab provides ask questions important for both tools, and you see that we're asking folks to enter the information in these yellow beige cells, most of which on this page are simply enter the information if available, and the blue information here is the NTT optional information I've shown you previously. The third tab is for COMET historical management page only. And you can see that there are drop-down menus here, and these mirror precisely the questions from pre-1980 about CRP and from 1980 to 2000. And these are drop-down menus, and you can see right here, those are the responses. Back to the main data entry form right here. So the first thing you're probably noticing is, wow, that's a lot of rows, right? Well, that is the doing and the desire for using COMET Farm. You need a lot of data input for each of those years. The second thing you'll notice is these first two columns, notable weather and soil health initiation. It was pretty helpful, I think, for our authors to just jot down for themselves prior to conducting the interview when the soil health practices were initiated, so that they could pay extra special attention to the management changes that occurred that year. Also helpful is this notable weather information, because COMET Farm data is very year and even day specific. So they put the bit of fear of God in us, because, you know, it is very painful to try to recreate and ask farmers to remember what they grew and how they grew it all the way in the past. But they did indicate that if you happen to say you did fertilizer application or compost application and you selected a date in which the weather data set indicated there was a big rain, well, you're going to get penalized for that. And so trying to be as accurate as possible was sort of hounded into us by the COMET Farm team. And our authors, to varying degrees, were able to accomplish that. Let's see, the drop-down menus. So the drop-down menus occur wherever an LN indicated with the word drop-down, and where you see over here the word is not there, and so those are open-ended questions, and in this case, yes, no questions. But the drop-down offer the opportunity to choose what COMET has available in its drop-down menu and what NTT has available in its drop-down menu. And I'll show you the links back here. These are all the available options for growing almonds in Madera County. And so if you are trying to grow almonds, or your client is, and they're in a different county, or you're trying to focus on another crop, be sure to check in with that COMET Farm and that NTT website to make sure you modify these drop-down menus, because they may be different. They might not be when you switch crop production systems and when you switch locations. And then if you need to change with the content here or add on, that tips to tweak drop-down menus document, if you're not already an Excel whiz, might be helpful. So read that document, watch that video. Back to the COMET NTT data entry site. Another thing you'll notice is color coding. So down here, we have some trusty rusty notes that indicates we established a color scheme. Orange is a question asked for by both COMET and NTT. White is a question asked by COMET only, and blue is a question asked only by NTT. So if you feel that maybe this is a helpful questionnaire, but you actually don't want to work in NTT or don't want to work in COMET, you can remove the blue columns for the NTT questions or the white columns for the COMET questions, and then you know that the questions in this dark orange are questions that are asked by both tools. So let us proceed through the questions. The first thing you'll see is after answering the question, what'd you grow? And you know, for the Rogers farm, wherein it was a row crop farm earlier, you'd be indicating how those row crops were grown prior to it being an orchard. There are pruning and renewing questions. There are planting questions and NTT to get through the tool. Harvest questions, tillage, again, important if there was a row crop prior to an orchard, and then commercial fertilizer. One thing to note here is that the fertilizer lists are different, and you know, it may be hard, you know, some of our farmers express dismay or disappointment with our interviewers that they couldn't find the exact same fertilizer mix that they use, but you know, this is all modeling. These are the best efforts possible. These are the closest estimates to reality, so you do your best to find something that works for you and the grower. Another thing you'll notice that this represents, all these questions are associated with one application of fertilizer. And if there's a second, there's your set of question. And if there's a third, there's your set of question. And if there happens to be a fourth or fifth, you can simply copy and paste all of the questions and create your fourth and fifth application section. Then you move into the compost and manure section, and that's pretty self-explanatory. And here are choices in NTT, and here are choices in COMET Farm. Moving on to the irrigation section, there are some nice tips down here. I thought they were down here. And we'll make sure that they're down there when we share this with you, that come from Dr. Saleh in helping us understand how to interpret these questions. So
Michelle, that's in the
yes.
structural section.
Okay, very good. Thank you for letting me know. So I will get to that very shortly. Finally, liming and burning questions, and then you have conservation cover or cover crop questions. And surprisingly, you know, both tools want to make sure that, you know, they prefer that cover crops are grown according to the NRCS specification, but in case cover crops are actually tilled, fertilizer is applied, manure or compost is applied, they may be irrigated, they may be limed, they may be burned. There's an opportunity to tell the tools about those details as well. And then this last section is the conservation structural practice section, and it's NTT only. Remember, NTT cares about structural practices. COMET Farm does not. It does not have an effect on the greenhouse gas simulation of COMET Farm. And this is where Ellen is reminding me that our tips and guidance from Dr. Saleh are found for the auto irrigation or fertigation set of questions that are featured in the conservation structural practice questions. So if these structural practices and assessing them is important to you, terrific, the questions are here. But you know, this is a soil health focused analysis, and so we only wanted to make sure you choosing a focus field had to have the structural practice on the field in the before scenario and the after scenario in order to essentially minimize or wipe out or make neutral the effect of the conservation of that structural practice in order to focus in on the effect of the soil health practices. So, you know, this is maybe a helpful questionnaire for you. Not all, some of our authors followed it to a T as best as they could. Other authors preferred to use it as a guide to prepare their own single page or couple of pages of in Word to conduct and store their NTT questions, but they really liked the year by year approach for the COMET questions. Some tips from other farmers, noting when the main soil health changes occurred could then help isolate the different management changes. And since most farmers were not up for, a true specific and didn't have the data for it, to feed into the tool, they were fine with guesstimates, for the entire period of one soil health practice. They were fine with all of the management questions reflecting how that production system was grown. And then once a major change in a soil health practice occurred later, they were fine with that intervening time period managed one way. So it's up to you and your farmer as to data availability, how much time they're interested in working with you, and how much detailed and faithful representation of the production system that you want to put into it. So.
Good morning. This is Flo Swartz. I'm going to provide you with an introduction to the Predictive Soil Health Economics Calculator, the P-SHEC tool, which is currently being tested by AFT staff. We hope to have a version ready for public release later this year. We developed the P-SHEC in order to evaluate potential benefits and costs of soil health practices. We're hoping it will help growers who have not tried soil health practices visualize how these practices could work on their farm or orchard by examining impacts to their bottom line. The tool is interactive, enabling the user to evaluate a range of potential effects. I'll begin with a comparison of the P-SHEC with the R-SHEC, which was covered in last week's training. For those of you who were unable to join us, I encourage you to access the recording of the webinar once it becomes available. This comparison is followed by an overview of the P-SHEC. As part of the overview, I will include a review of key economic concepts from last week's session, as well as an introduction to some new concepts employed by the P-SHEC. Note that the P-SHEC tool, like the R-SHEC tool, is meant for use by conservationists who may not have an economics degree. Nevertheless, it's important to have a basic understanding of a few key concepts as you begin using the tool with farmers who are curious about soil health practices. I'll also go over the two main segments of the P-SHEC, the short-term and long-term analyses. My presentation will conclude with a live demonstration of the P-SHEC. The most obvious difference between the two tools is their purpose. The R-SHEC is designed for use with growers already experienced with soil health practices, evaluating costs and benefits that have already occurred by comparing pre-adoption to current conditions. Whereas the P-SHEC is forward-looking and is designed for growers who have not yet adopted one or more soil health practices, and examines potential changes in costs and benefits in both the short-term and long-term. The short-term analysis portion looks at immediate changes likely to occur, comparing costs of practice implementation with potential short-term benefits such as anticipated savings in fertilizer cost. Note that increases in yield are not included in the P-SHEC short-term effects because it generally takes longer than 1 or 2 years for soil improvement to affect yields. We do not include yield changes in the R-SHEC we do include yield changes in the R-SHEC, since the retrospective analysis spans anywhere from 5 to 10 or more years, which is sufficient time to observe changes in yield. Like the R-SHEC, the short-term analysis in the P-SHEC is organized as a partial budget analysis. The long-term analysis of the P-SHEC evaluates the future impact of expected improvements to soil organic matter, or SOM, on yield, nutrient mineralization, and water holding capacity over a user-defined planning horizon. Results from the long-term analysis are expressed as annualized present values and are ultimately added to the short-term results to obtain combined results. This slide provides a good visual comparison between the two tools. You may recall that the R-SHEC has 3 brown tabs at the back containing supporting information such as prices and machinery costs, as well as drop-down menus. The P-SHEC tool has the same 3 tabs for the short-term analysis portion of the workbook and 6 additional tabs shown here in purple to handle the long-term analysis. We'll take a closer look at these tabs during the live demonstration. Now, I'd like to focus on the P-SHEC itself. This tool evaluates the same 4 conservation practices as the R-SHEC, performing both a short-term and long-term analysis. Short-term effects changes are mainly associated with changes to machinery use and inputs, while the long-term benefits include the value of improved yields, soil fertility, and water storage for either dryland farms or irrigated operations. The period of time for the long-term analysis is set by the user and can be anywhere from 5 to 20 years. I also want to point out that because of the method we use to predict increases in SOM, unlike the R-SHEC where a user could specify different acreages for various practices adopted, the P-SHEC assumes that planned soil health practices are implemented on all acres in the study area. Before going further, I want to review some economic concepts covered in last week's session, namely general rules for economic analysis and partial budget analysis. To ensure accuracy of any analysis, keep these 4 rules in mind. Make sure all dollar values are from the same year. All values, whether costs or quantities, must be for the same physical area. All costs or quantities must be on an annual basis, and avoid double counting. I'm using this screenshot showing a portion of the P-SHEC short-term partial budget analysis table as a visual reminder of the layout for a PBA or partial budget analysis, where positive effects, that is, increased income or decreased costs, are on the left, and negative effects, or decreased income and increased costs, are on the right. Net results appear at the bottom of the table. As with the R-SHEC, this table will auto-populate based on entries made in each of the practice tabs. I have a couple more key economic concepts to go over, but first I need to introduce the long-term analysis to provide context. So we already know that the long-term analysis portion of the P-SHEC examines benefits expected to accrue over a user-specified planning horizon of up to 20 years. We use changes in % soil organic matter as a proxy for improvements in soil health over time. The tool is designed to evaluate 3 types of benefits: yield improvement, improved soil fertility due to improved nutrient mineralization, and improved water storage, which is manifested through either improved drought tolerance in dryland or non-irrigated farming operations, or reduced costs of irrigation. The grower provides their estimate of what the anticipated improvements may be for each of these categories associated with a 1% increase in SOM. As I mentioned, long-term benefits are tied to the predicted increase in % SOM, where SOM serves as a proxy for overall soil health. So how quickly benefits accrue has to do with the rate of increase in % SOM. To make the tool as accurate as possible, we have designed the P-SHEC to provide estimates of this annual rate of change based on location of the farm and planned soil health management changes. The example on the right is an illustration of increased SOM by year for Joe Spalk's analysis based on potential adoption of 2 soil health practices. Let's take a look behind the curtain and see how we calculate the annual change in % SOM. Michelle has already acquainted you with COMET Farm and COMET Planner as methods for estimating changes in greenhouse gas emissions, including CO2, which directly influences changes in SOM. We latched onto COMET Planner for the P-SHEC because it provides an easy way to estimate changes in CO2 sequestration at the county level for 21 soil health management changes called Conservation Practice Implementation by COMET Planner. A few of these appear on the right in this screenshot from COMET Planner. This 3-step process is easy enough when considering a single county and practice combination, but we wanted to build COMET Planner results into P-SHEC, automating the analysis as much as possible. For California alone, There are over 1,200 results. We were fortunate enough to have assistance from 2 AFT Climate Initiative scientists, Jennifer Moore-Kucera and Tabitha Brown, who had obtained the complete national dataset from COMET Planner's staff containing results for every county in the US for the 21 different soil health management changes. They were able to pull the data for the 4 states covered by the NRCS SIG into a separate database. Using the COMET Planner outcome, next slide. Using the COMET Planner output of tons CO2 sequestered per year, Jennifer and Tabitha developed the formula shown here to convert CO2 to percent SOM per year. The result is the annual percent change in SOM by county for any of 21 different soil health management options. One thing that surprised us was how low this annual percent change was, not only in California, but in the other 3 states included in our study. Now that we have our means of estimating future benefits identified, we need to discuss how we're going to equate these future benefits with our short-term analysis. We have 2 problems. We anticipate a series of annual increasing positive effects going out as many as 20 years into the future as annual increases in SOM drive incremental increases in yield, soil fertility, and water storage based on the grower's estimates. How do we equate these future values with current dollar values? And we need to combine up to 20 future values into a single value. This is why I'm going to introduce the concept of annualized present value. Let's start with present value. We all know that money has more value when you're holding it in your hand than if someone promised to give you the same amount a year from now. So you can see in this graphic on the right, the future stack of coins must be higher to be considered equivalent to the present stack. Present value accounts for this difference in value, and not surprisingly, there is a formula which discounts future money to a present value based on the selected interest rate. The chart on this slide provides a nice illustration of how this discounting works. The blue line represents the per acre value of expected yield increases each year going out 15 years. The green line shows how the values are discounted to a present value equivalent. Now that we've addressed the first problem of equating future values to current or present values, let's turn to the second problem of putting that entire discounted benefit stream on an annual basis. You will recall that we have a rule stating that all values must be on an annual basis for a sound economic analysis. This means we can't simply add up all 15 years of yield benefits, even if the values have been discounted, since that would give us the total present value spanning a 15-year period and not an annual value. If each of these bars in this chart represents a stack of coins, we would end up with a big pile of coins, accounting for the total value of the 15 years of analysis. We could take a simple average to approximate the annual value of the 15 years of improved yields, but the more accurate way is to amortize the sum of the discounted benefit stream, much like a periodic home mortgage payment is based on a total lump sum with an assigned interest rate and term. We can arrive at an annualized present value for our benefit stream by summing the present values for all 15 years and amortizing the result. The variables shown in the equation can be translated as follows. A is the discounted annual present value. P is the sum of the discounted benefit stream. I is the interest rate, and N is the number of years of benefits, or 15 in our example. We can now calculate an annualized present value for future yield benefits. Here you see we have summed the present value column of the benefit stream and applied the amortization formula to the $1,711 total. with a 3% rate of interest and a 15-year period to obtain $143.35 discounted annual per acre yield benefit. So by way of a summary, the P-SHEC calculates the annualized present value of a benefit stream for improvements to yield, soil fertility, and water storage based on increases in percent SOM. The table illustrates how these long-term results are summarized. Now I'll give you a quick overview of the questionnaire we're using to collect the information needed to run the P-SHEC. Part 1 is the form for data to collect ahead of time, used to determine the study area and identify practices of interest. The form also asks whether the farmer or grower would like to include COMET Farm, COMET Planner, or NTT in their assessment. Part 2 of the questionnaire collects the information for the short-term analysis, and as I mentioned earlier, assumes soil health practices will be used on all acres in the study area. Both parts 1 and 2 of the questionnaire are very similar to the R-SHEC questionnaire with some minor adjustments. However, part 3 is completely different as it covers the information used in the long-term analysis. This portion of the questionnaire asks the grower to identify their planting horizon, interest rate, and soil health management options. The most difficult part is figuring out how changes in percent SOM affect our 3 benefit categories: yield, soil fertility, and water storage for either dryland farming or irrigated operations. We provide guidance in both the questionnaire and the workbook and encourage AFT staff, together with growers, to try a range of values and examine the results. And now I'm going to turn to a live demonstration of the actual tool. So let me get started here. And this is the P-SHEC tool. And for those of you who were on the webinar last week, it should look very familiar. It's very similar to the R-SHEC. We're on the README tab, and it starts out with the README tab. I won't go into detail. It has a lot of the same information with some changes, but I will remind you all that the workbook is protected, and the only cells that users have access to are ones with this pale yellow shading here. If for some reason you wanted to gain access to a worksheet, you can do that by clicking on this file up in the corner here, Info, and you can see over here all of the protected sheets, and you can just click Unprotect to gain access to a worksheet. So we'll go through very quickly the front end of this tool, which is basically the short-term analysis, and again is very similar to the R-SHEC. We have a Farm Info tab. We have our 4 conservation practice tabs here. I went ahead and put in some information so that it's calculating short-term benefits and costs for implementing a couple of practices, namely cover crops and compost application. And then if we go over here to the partial budget analysis, we have the full table here for Joe Smith, fictitious farmer obviously. And down at the bottom, the summary of the results. And you can see that we have negative results here, negative $74 per acre with a 53% return on investment. And I should have mentioned back here on the Farm Info tab, I did enter information for the farm itself, and it's just important to note that we're looking at a 100-acre study area, which gets used in the long-term analysis. So that's the short-term analysis. We have negative returns, and we're going to now turn to the back end of the workbook, or the long-term analysis. This is the long-term analysis tab where we'll be entering information, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but I'm just going to take you through the end of the workbook so you can see the supporting tabs that are doing the computations that get used on this page, on this tab in the workbook. The next tab is the Combined Results tab. And then we have our 3 brown tabs, and these are the same tabs that we saw in the R-SHEC tool. The next tab is the first of these pale purple tabs that are supporting tabs for the long-term analysis. This is the discounting long-term benefits tab. It should look familiar because I just showed you a slide where we actually had some values for yield improvement, and we saw how the current benefit per year was then calculated into a present value and summed at the bottom and amortized. Likewise, we have 2 columns here for soil fertility, same idea. And then for water storage, we have 4 columns here. We have a pair of columns for dryland farming and a pair of columns for irrigation farming. And finally, over here at the far right, we have a break-even analysis that's going to, when we've completed our data input, tell us how many years before we break even with the soil health practices being implemented. You can see that that short-term net returns are already in here, and it's just waiting for us to put in our total long-term benefits, and then it will give us an idea of when we could expect to break even. Continuing on, we have our list tab for soil organic matter. These are drop-down menus, and they're also used in VLOOKUP formulas in the workbook. This tab is a tab that explains the calculations that are taking place for figuring out rates of nutrient mineralization in the soil as SOM improves. And it's based on a document produced by NRCS, Soil Health Guide for Educators. And so this is here as documentation. It actually does the calculation based on the bulk density of whatever class of texture of soil you input on the long-term benefits tab. The next tab is basically more documentation explaining all the relationships that are behind the calculations for calculating soil fertility improvements. And here we have the tab that's showing us the results from COMET Planner that we pulled into this workbook for California for all of the various soil management changes that could be made for every county in California. And so we have a lot of location information, and then we have information about the practices or variations that could be used. And then column I here is the first, this column is the data that's coming out of COMET Planner for CO2. So this is the data that's generated by COMET Planner that the AFT folks helped us with. Jennifer and Tabitha pulled this in, and then they developed that long formula that I showed you on the slide, which goes through all of these columns doing the computations to come up with, at the very end, percent of soil organic matter change per year based on the state of California, in this case Alameda County, and converting to permanent unfertilized grass or legume cover. This is the percent SOM change per year based on output from COMET Planner where we did those computations. And so this is what actually gets used back on that long-term benefits tab. And the next tab here, again, this should look familiar. I showed you this in a slide, and this is documentation for the formula that they used to come up with that percent change in SOM per year. So now we'll go back to the long-term benefits tab and proceed down by putting some information in. We have some boxes that you can click on here that then provide you with, oh dear, I don't know where that went. I've got 2 screens, it's not showing up, but these will provide you with guidance on values that you may want to enter in here. And it looks like I actually have to find that in order to close it down. Just bear with me for a second. See if I can locate where it went. Here we go, found it. I'm not going to click on any more of those because it's causing me problems. Just trust me that these have guidance to help you choose what values you may want to put in here. So I'm going to go with 20 years and then a 3% discount or interest rate. And then we'll pick, for a county, we'll pick San Joaquin County. And now we're at the point where we can pick soil health management changes. And so we're going to go with, they'll say, add a legume cover, or didn't have mulching in the front end, and we're going to go to compost. We'll go with replacing synthetic nitrogen with compost with a seed-end ratio of 15. And you can see that the cells for percent SOM per year automatically populated based on that big table that I just showed you, and adds up the result down here. as your combined percent change in SOM per year based on adopting these two management changes in San Joaquin County, California. So we'll go down now that we've got our SOM change identified and apply it to these soil or to these various benefit categories, starting with yield increases. And again, we have a lot of guidance here. We have some information in this box, and we mentioned that the two almond growers experienced 15% change in yield as guidance for what to put in here. But we start out with current year yield, and we'll say that's 2,000 pounds per acre. And we'll go with that 15% change in yield that was experienced by the two case study farmers. And now it's calculated a 300-pound change in yield. At this point, you have the option of using the standard price that's in here, and this is a 2019 price. I will be updating this tool very soon as the 2020 values have become available. If you want, you have the option of putting in your own price, and you can see right now it's calculating a value of $729 based on the 300-pound change in yield and the $2.43 price. If we decide we want to say use $2, then it takes this, whatever you put in this cell as a default, and won't use the built-in value. But we'll go back to the built-in value for this analysis and then move down to, oh, before I go down, I need to point out that it's calculated that discounted annual yield increase in benefit at $272. So we started out at $729, but we have a discounted annual benefit of $272. And if we take a peek over here, while we were busy on that long-term benefits tab, you can see that percent SOM column populated when we put in those key values up at the top. And now because we put in our yield information, all of this information has come in, and we've calculated our amortized present value at 271. So let's continue on down. And in the soil fertility benefit, we need to enter values for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And we have over here suggested values. We'll just go ahead and use those, but you can use, put in whatever values you think would be appropriate for those three types of fertilizer. And then we have our dominant soil texture. And here we have a drop-down menu. We'll say it's sand. And as soon as we put sand in, you notice that our mineralization rates popped in here because they were waiting to find out what bulk density to apply to the formulas back on that tab that I showed you a few minutes ago. Now, if you don't like these values, you have the option of putting your own values in if the farmer has some idea what their mineralization rates might be. We also have some suggested rates over here based on some assistance that we got from Alan Lubers with ARS in Raleigh, North Carolina, and some additional research that we did on soil organic matter with phosphorus and sulfur. So there's all kinds of options for people to use here. The soil fertility benefit based on the values that are calculated is 908. The discounted value is $3.39. And then we'll continue down to our water storage benefits. And here there are two options. You can either calculate these benefits based on your costs for pumping, current pumping costs of dollars per acre per inch and the volume of water that you're using, or the cost for energy, diesel fuel or electricity, either in gallons or kilowatt hours, and your current use of the same, whether it's diesel or electricity. And then down here, we have the farmer has to decide how much of a savings they would have in a percentage terms if they got a 1% increase in SOM. So we'll go with the first one here, and we'll say that the pumping costs are $13 per acre inch, and the current water use is 40 acre inches per year. And then we come down here and we say that their percent savings is going to be 10%, and it calculates out $52, but of course that has to be discounted, and we come up with $19.40 per acre, or $1,940 for that 100-acre study area. So let's go down. Here's that summary of the long-term benefits you see here, where we've just basically pulled all these values down and added them together. And then the remaining step is to combine everything together. And so this tab has brought forward our negative short-term partial budget analysis results of minus $53 an acre. And it brought forward our summary of long-term benefits at $294 per acre, combines them, and we have a net gain of $221, or a rate of return on investment of 158%, and number of years to break even is 3. And I have to apologize, I have steam heat and it's starting, and you may hear some banging of the pipes in the background, but I'll be done shortly and you won't have to listen to it. I just want to show you really quickly, finally, one last visit to this tab of our discounting long-term benefits, and you see the whole thing has been filled in except for dryland farming because we didn't include that. But you see everything is populated here. We have our break-even analysis. It goes from negative to positive between 3 and 4 years, and so that's why we got the three-year value in here.
All right, Paul, you are up. This is Paul Lum, AFT's California Program Manager.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for your interest in our training. As the California Project Manager, I conducted the predictive assessment for Jost Bulk of Bulk Farms. Today, I'm going to describe the predictive assessment findings. I hope that at the end of the session, you'll have a better understanding of how the predictive assessment can benefit you and the growers that you work with. Here's a summary of Bulk's farming operation and the healthy soils that he adopted and what practices he plans to adopt. His orchard is located in Merced County on flat sandy soils. Prior to 2020, prior to last year, he adopted nutrient management, mulching of the annual prunings, fertigation, and he maintained resident vegetation in the middles. The findings of the predictive assessment will help him determine whether 2 new practices, namely cover crop seeding and compost application, will increase his net return in the long run. Bulk's resource concerns are soil compaction and soil structure, water holding capacity, and nutrient availability. Jost reached out to me after reading the 2 almond case studies. He said he was interested in AFT's programs, including any future field trials and predictive assessments. Jost says, "My motivation is to build up the soil as much as possible." This table shows the potential increases in net income based on Bulk's estimates of input costs if he were to adopt the new practices. This is a short-term analysis. There are no predicted yield increases in the short term. However, there are decreases in costs. There is herbicide reduction as a result of weed suppression from the cover crop, reduction in nitrogen and potash as a result of compost application, reduced mowing due to cover cropping, and reduced beehive rental costs due to the increased bee activity as a result of the cover crops. The total decreased cost is $5,789 for the study area, or $175 per acre. This table shows the potential decreases in net income in the short term. There are no anticipated decreases in income. There are increased costs associated with the cover cropping and compost application. The cover crop seeds, planting equipment, and labor is $87 per acre. The compost spreading is $163 per acre, bringing the total cost to $8,266 for the study area, or $250 per acre. The short-term analysis shows that Bulk might experience a decrease in net returns from his investment in soil health practices. The annual change in total net return is a negative $2,477, or a negative $75 per acre. The return in investment is a negative 30%. This slide shows the general data used in the long-term analysis. First, the grower chooses a planting horizon. Bulk selected a 15-year horizon based on the productive lifespan for almond trees. A 3% discount rate was chosen based on our recommendation. And listed are the practices that Bulk would like assessed: cover crops planted annually and compost applied annually. Note that the estimated annual change in SOM for COMET planner is based on the two soil health practices selected, meaning that SOM could increase by 0.52% at the end of the 15-year planning horizon. Data entry and the long-term analysis. Now let's focus on Bulk's data for calculating yield improvement. Bulk's average yield prior to 2020 was 1,500 pounds per acre. He hopes to increase his yield by 15% over the course of the planning horizon after adopting the soil health practices. The tool includes the default price for almonds at $2.43 a pound, which Bulk selected to use for the analysis. Note that the P-SHEC tool correlates soil type with SOM with respect to Central Valley soils, which are relatively low in SOM. The grower can modify the yield entry to compare findings. Soil fertility data. This next slide shows soil fertility inputs used for the Bulk predictive assessment. Joe selected to use standard fertilizer practices provided in the tool. The dominant soil texture is entered and the nutrient mineralization rates are calculated automatically based on bulk density for the soil texture class. The fertilizer prices assign a value to the pounds of mineralized nutrients. Water storage, data entry. The water storage benefit is the last of our 3 benefit categories. And here we have a summary of the information beginning with the water cost and water use that Joe's provided. For Joe's, he purchases surface water from an irrigation district and pumps it through his irrigation system. As a reminder, growers can enter diesel fuel or electricity use for the water costs. Long-term benefit results. This slide provides long-term benefits. The table displays the discounted annual yield increase, soil fertility benefit, and irrigation savings. As you can see, the biggest anticipated increase in income comes from the anticipated yield increase, with an estimated discounted yield benefit of $143 per acre or $4,731 for the orchard, based on Bulk's estimated 15% increase in yield and therefore associated with a 1% increase in SOM. The soil fertility improvement over 15 years gives us a modest discounted benefit of $3.99 per acre per year, or $132 for the study area. And Bulk's discounted irrigation savings due to improved water holding capacity are estimated at about $11 per acre per year, or $362 for the study area. Combined results. This slide shows the combined results of the predictive assessment. Recall the short-term negative value of $75 per acre and the long-term benefit of $158 per acre. The combined result indicates an annual change in net income of $83 per acre, or $2,748 total from adopting the cover crops and compost. The return of investment is 33%, and the number of years before breaking even is 6 years. Next steps. Joe's plans to utilize a predictive assessment tool interactively once it's released to help estimate outcomes from soil health practices and to help guide management decisions. He is taking steps to improve soil health. Last November, he planted a seed for bees cover crop mix, and he also applied compost. He plans to continue attending educational events such as webinars and workshops to learn about soil health practices, and he'll continue with his leaf and soil sampling program. Well, that concludes my talk. And we have time for questions.
Great, thanks, Paul. So that concludes the presentations, and now we can spend the rest of the time taking any questions from our attendees.
I see one here, Ellen, from Tom. I imagine there may be some gaps in records to have full information for all elements in these tools. Without records, can we use typical practices and dollar estimates to fill in information gaps for environmental and economic tools? Yes, indeed. That is the #1 challenge in using any of these tools, especially the COMET farm tool that is so demanding for year-to-year data. And as I indicated, farmers don't have the data or the records. They don't have the time to hunt for them if they do have the records. And who wants to pour through 20 years of records for one field? And so I think that the COMET farm team and AFT's climate initiative, in fact, are trying to independently and collectively collaborate to come up with, I think they're using templates as a keyword to say, well, if we face reality head on, and we know this is not a fun task, and farmers are okay with, more generalized and smoothed out and not actual day-to-day, year-to-year specific representation of management activities in the COMET farm tool. If everyone gets on the same page and is okay with that, and that's well known and transparent, how do we smooth out the data gaps? So that is a long way of saying folks are paying a lot of attention to this and trying to work on it. And during, I think, trying to address the economic side of the story, Paul and other authors dialogue with the farmers, and given many of our authors are also farmers themselves and or have an agronomy degree, and bring to the interview the latest data and prices of cover crops, nutrient management, mulching, and composting. If the farmer, is so early on his or her or their conservation journey, the author, the interviewer, can come with some already, gleaned economic costs, already gleaned environmental insights to help the farmer with the interview process, in particular the economic side of the story. So that is my reaction to that question. Feel free to round that out, Flo or Paul, but I do see we also have another question.
Yeah, I'll chirp in on that. With my experience in the case studies and using COMET Farm, we did dialogue quite a bit with the farmer and get their best guesstimates and pair that up with typical inputs. For instance, fertilizer applied to a cotton or corn crop 15 years ago, or for instance, 10 years before the orchard was planted. Typical costs and inputs, and we use UC production cost guide, which is well researched, well documented, and basically took that approach with the data entry.
Great.
And I'll also speak on behalf of Flo, who might be trying to unmute herself, but she might have said, we took a lot of effort to work with several ARS scientists, ERS, Economic Research Service, and NRCS scientists and economists to, squeeze blood from stone. We talked to and interviewed and conducted a lot of research to find what are the available known economic and environmental linkages. So we didn't want to push the balance of literature too far, but you can see in all those nice pop-up tables, pop-up windows that if you only have one screen would pop up no problem. It's challenging with two screens. but there was also tables, with displayed information and links to where the information behind the tool from. And, Flo shows all, what is it, not how many tabs, Flo, at the end there of data and all of this.
Yeah, there's 6 tabs for just supporting data for the long-term analysis. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're very transparent. All the folks that came to the table with their latest available published and unpublished analysis is well documented. So we hope with all this transparency, you can feel some level of confidence in this, and these tools will only get better over time. So we welcome your assistance.
Great, thanks, Michelle. We have another question that about Paul's presentation, and I can go back to this slide that they're referring to, but the question is, was bulk's return on investment positive or negative? And I will show that slide. Just a second. So, Paul, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, I could address this. If you look at the top portion of the table, the short-term analysis shows a negative return of investment, and that's attributed to the cover crop seeding costs and compost application costs. And because it is short-term, there is not enough time, the long-term benefit doesn't kick in for a yield value. So the summary of long-term benefits, there is in the row discounted annual yield increase. And so that contributes to on the positive side, increase in income. And so the combined results, the yield increase and long-term benefit on the positive offsets the short-term decrease in change in income. So we show for the combined results a 33% return in investment and 6 years to break even, as opposed to the short term of 30%. And I will agree with Michelle and Flo's statements that this is a conservative approach, and the model is conservative, and it's a foundation for the predictive assessment tool. And I think the growers actually will, understand and agree that this is a conservative approach. Many growers hope to achieve, greater benefits, greater economic benefits.
Yeah, Flo, so you can speak to perhaps why we can't calculate an ROI for the long-term benefits. Maybe that's why they're getting caught up.
Oh, okay. Well, because the long-term benefits are all benefits. And so the costs are being borne year over year with those changes or additions of soil health practices that Paul outlined earlier, the cost for planting cover every year, the cost for adding compost every year. So those costs, while they say short-term benefit, they're happening every year over the 15-year period. And so the long-term benefits themselves are basically just benefits. Now, I don't know whether you noticed it, but in the workbook, there is a net present value calculation to come up with that break even. And so net present value, or NPV, is basically comparing that annualized cost of $75 with the present value of whatever the benefit is in that year. And so as you go forward, they change. And I don't know if I'm getting too far into the weeds here, but basically that's why we don't show an ROI for the long-term benefits, because we're only talking about benefits in there, and we're assuming that those annual short-term costs are going on every year. And so when we combine our results and we have our short-term net costs, we can combine those with our long-term benefits, and that's when we see the return on investment. I hope that makes sense.